What's up everyone? You're here at Watch Harry. We're dropping something epic today. Petunia activated Lily's death will and ancient Potter law named Harry Lord of 8 noble houses overnight. Like and subscribe if you enjoy. Let's get started. Chapter 1, The Letter That Changed Everything. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Harry always thought was the most unremarkable day of the week, and therefore the most likely day for remarkable things to happen. He was at Grimmauld Place when the owl came, a severe-looking ministry bird with a black ribbon tied around its leg, the kind that meant someone had died. Harry knew that ribbon. He'd seen it 3 times in the last 2 years, and each time it had landed in his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. He took the envelope. The owl left without waiting for a reply. Sirius looked up from the kitchen table, where he'd been attempting, and largely failing, to fix a Muggle coffee maker that someone had left behind during the Order's occupation of the house. He had grease on his hands and a look on his face that suggested the coffee maker was losing. "Ministry ribbon," he said. "Yeah. Who?" Harry turned the envelope over. His name was written on the front in the stiff, formal script of the Department of Magical Records, but the sender listed in the lower corner made him go very still. Petunia Dursley, née Evans. Deceased. He set the envelope down on the table. Not gently, not roughly. Just set it down and stared at it. Sirius crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and looked over his shoulder. A beat of silence. "Harry, I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't." "You were about to." Sirius pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. He didn't say anything else. That was one of the things Harry had come to understand about Sirius in the 2 years since he hadn't fallen through the veil, since the curse had caught the edge of his robes instead of his chest, since Dumbledore had pulled him back with a summoning charm that Harry still wasn't entirely sure was legal. Sirius knew when to talk and when to simply be there. He'd learned that in Azkaban, maybe. Or maybe he'd always known it and the 12 years inside had just stripped away everything else, leaving only the parts that mattered. Harry opened the envelope. There were 2 things inside. The first was the official ministry notification, a form letter, really, with his name filled in by hand, informing him that one Petunia Dursley had passed away on the 14th of July at St. Giles Hospital, London, of cardiac failure. The next of kin, one Vernon Dursley, had been notified. The letter went on to explain, in the ministry's characteristically bloodless prose, that the deceased had lodged a magical document with the Department of Magical Records 11 years prior, to be activated upon her death, and that said document named Harry James Potter as primary recipient. Harry read that part twice. "She lodged something with the ministry," he said. 11 years ago. I would have been 6. Sirius frowned. Petunia went to the ministry? Apparently. Harry set the notification aside and picked up the second document. It was older, clearly, the parchment had a different weight and color to it, cream-yellowed slightly at the edges, and it was sealed with 2 things that made his chest tighten. The first was a standard ministry seal in red wax. The second, pressed directly into the parchment itself, was a seal he recognized from his vault at Gringotts, the one he'd never quite known what to make of. The Potter family crest. He broke both seals. The document unfolded itself, which was the first indication that it wasn't an ordinary ministry form. It spread across the table to roughly twice the size it should have been, and the handwriting on it shifted as he looked, not Petunia's cramped, precise hand, but something older, as though the act of opening it had triggered some deeper layer of the document to reveal itself. He read it aloud, because that felt necessary, and because Sirius was leaning forward with an expression Harry hadn't seen on his face since the early days of the war. "I, Petunia Dursley, née Evans, of sound mind, being the surviving blood kin of one Lily Marie Potter, née Evans, do hereby activate the following in accordance with the ancient Potter Inheritance Accords of 1203, as lodged with the Department of Magical Records under Clause 7 of the Blood Succession Covenant. Upon my death, all matters of blood right, lineage inheritance, And dormant house claims held in suspension by the Lily Marie Potter Inheritance Trust are to be released in full to Harry James Potter, blood son of Lily Marie Potter, and the sole surviving heir of the Potter line. This document also releases, in accordance with the Evans-Emery's genealogical record held in trust at Gringotts, London, the full accounting of the Evans bloodline as traced and verified by the Goblin Genealogists Guild in the year 1979, commissioned by Lily Marie Potter, née Evans, before her death. I could have burned this. I almost did, 3 times. But Lily was my sister before she was anything else, and whatever I failed her in life, I will not fail her son in this. Petunia Yvonne Dursley. Witnessed and sealed. The kitchen was completely silent. Harry finished reading and didn't look up from the document for a long moment. He could hear the old pipes in Grimmauld Place settling, the distant sound of wind against the narrow windows, and nothing else. She commissioned a genealogy, Sirius said finally. His voice was careful in the way it got when he was working through something and didn't want to say the wrong thing. Lily did. Before she died. Before she was 21. Harry smoothed the edge of the parchment with his thumb. She was 19 when she had me. She commissioned a genealogy when she was 20 or younger, hid it in Gringotts, and then told Petunia about it. And Petunia held on to it for 16 years. 16 years, Harry agreed. Something moved in his chest, complicated and uncomfortable, the way things always got when he tried to think about Petunia Dursley. She had been cruel in the particular way of people who are frightened, and she had been frightened in the way of people who know they are keeping a secret that is bigger than them. He understood that now, even if understanding it didn't fix anything. She almost burned it 3 times. But she didn't. But she didn't. Sirius reached across the table and turned the document slightly so he could read the opening passage again. His brow furrowed. The Ancient Potter Inheritance Accords of 1203. Harry, I know what that is. Tell me. Sirius pushed back from the table and stood up, already moving toward the library. It's old magic, older than the Ministry, older than most of the wizarding laws that people think of as ancient. The 1203 Accords were put in place after the last great magical civil war in Britain, the one that almost ended the whole thing. The surviving noble houses came together and drew up a covenant, a set of rules to govern inheritance, succession, and house claims, specifically to prevent any one faction from wiping out a bloodline and claiming everything. Harry followed him into the library. The Black Family Library was, like everything else about Grimmauld Place, enormous and unsettling and occasionally dangerous. He'd gotten used to it. So it's succession law. It's ancient succession law, which is completely different. Sirius was pulling books from shelves with the focused energy of a man who was genuinely glad to have something to do with his hands. Modern inheritance law goes through the Ministry. You file documents, you go before the Wiesengemot, you pay fees, you wait 6 months. Ancient succession law bypasses all of that. It operates on blood magic and oath binding, it activates automatically when the conditions are met. The Ministry doesn't get to approve it. They just have to acknowledge it. He found the book he was looking for, a thick, dark green volume titled Blood Covenants and the Noble Succession, with a spine so worn the title was barely legible, and dropped it on the reading table. It fell open to a page that Harry suspected wasn't an accident. House claims, Harry read from the page. Blood-activated dormant lordships. The accords provide that if a house falls dormant, no active lord, no active magic, the claim can be held in suspension and pass through secondary bloodlines rather than being extinguished. The claim becomes active again when. He stopped reading and looked up. When a qualifying heir meets the conditions. Which are? Sirius asked, though something in his tone said he already knew. Harry looked back at the book. Age of Magical Majority. A blood seal activation, which just happened. He paused. And a recognized triggering event from the nearest surviving blood kin. Petunia, Sirius said quietly. She was the last blood relative from Lily's side. When she died, she triggered it. And the document she lodged was the blood seal activation. She signed it, she sealed it with the Potter crest, and she lodged it with the Department of Magical Records so it couldn't be intercepted or destroyed. She protected it, Harry said. The words felt strange. She didn't understand what she was holding, probably, or she understood just enough to be frightened of it. But she protected it. He stood there in the library for a moment, thinking about a woman who had made his childhood miserable, who had hidden magic in a cupboard under the stairs and pretended the world was only as wide as a suburban street in Surrey. Who had, at some point, picked up a document that could change everything and chosen, 3 separate times, not to burn it. People, Harry had found, were almost never only one thing. Okay, he said. So Petunia's death activates whatever Lily set up. The Potter Inheritance Trust releases. He looked at Sirius. What was in the trust? That, Sirius said, is what Gringotts is for. They were at Gringotts by 9 the next morning, which required getting up at 7, which Harry managed with the grim efficiency of someone who had spent the better part of 2 years on a war footing and no longer had much patience for lying in bed wondering about things when he could simply go and find out. Hermione was waiting for them on the steps. She had a leather satchel over one shoulder, a notebook already in her hand, and the expression she wore when she had already done 3 hours of research and was suppressing the urge to lead with all of it at once. Behind her, Ron was eating a pasty and looking like someone who had been woken up somewhat earlier than he'd have chosen. Hermione, Harry said. Did I ask you to come? No, she said. Did you want me not to? I called her, Sirius said, moving past Harry to greet Hermione with a one-armed hug that she returned with genuine warmth. Because you would have called her yourself as soon as anything happened and this saves time. Also, Ron said, finishing his pasty, we read about Petunia in the Daily Prophet this morning. Brief notice, back page. Apparently she's survived by her husband and her son Dudley. He looked at Harry steadily. Which means they didn't put you in the notice at all. They never would, Harry said, without heat. That particular truth had lost its sting somewhere around the age of 11. It doesn't matter. Come on. The inside of Gringotts was always the same, vast marble floors, high ceilings, the steady sound of goblin business being conducted at teller stations with the professional efficiency of a people who had decided centuries ago that they were far more competent than anyone else and had simply never bothered to hide the fact. Harry had been inside enough times to be comfortable with it, which he suspected put him in a fairly small category among wizards. Most people found Gringotts intimidating. Harry found it refreshingly direct. The goblins would tell you exactly what they thought, and they would never lie to you about the numbers. There were worse qualities in a financial institution. He went to the nearest teller and handed over the ministry notification and the Petunia document. The goblin, Sharptooth, according to his brass nameplate, took both items, read them with the rapid, focused attention that goblins brought to everything, and then looked up at Harry with the particular expression of a creature who has just recognized that they are having a significantly more interesting morning than they had planned. Lord Potter, Sharptooth said. Just Harry is fine. That, Sharptooth said, will depend on what the vaults tell us. He stood. Follow me. They were taken not to the regular banking area but to a corridor Harry had never been in before, narrower, with walls of dark stone rather than marble, lit by the greenish light of small magical flames set into iron sconces. The door at the end was heavy, old, and covered in the kind of engravings that Harry had learned to recognize as functional rather than decorative. Every line was a ward. Every symbol was a seal. The door recognized him before he touched it, a faint golden warmth passed over him as he stepped close, and the engravings shifted, rearranging themselves. Blood recognition, Hermione murmured beside him, her quill already moving in her notebook. That's not normal Gringotts security. That's keyed to you specifically. Or to whatever Lily set up, Harry said. The room beyond the door was small and bare except for a stone table in the center, on which sat 3 objects, a carved box of dark wood, a rolled scroll of parchment sealed with more wax than Harry had ever seen on a single document, and a small, smooth object that looked like a river stone except that it was faintly, consistently glowing with a light the color of his mother's eyes. Sharptooth stood back. "The blood accounting stone first," he said. "Place your right hand on it. Do not remove it until it is finished. The process will be," he paused, "comprehensive." Harry placed his hand on the stone. It was warm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something moved through him, not painfully, nothing like the cruciatus, nothing violent. It was more like being read. Like the stone was going through him the way Hermione went through a text, quickly, thoroughly, finding everything and missing nothing. His blood. His magic. Every inherited thread, every dormant claim, every drop of lineage running back through years and decades and centuries. The stone's light went from green to gold to a white so bright everyone in the room looked away. Then it stopped. Harry lifted his hand. The stone was cool now and entirely dark. Sharptooth stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Harry with an expression that, on a goblin face, Harry read as something close to reverence, which was alarming because goblins did not do reverence. They did profit and competence and occasionally respect, but never reverence. "Sit down, Lord Potter," Sharptooth said quietly. "This will take some time." "I told you," Harry said, pulling out a chair. "Just Harry is, you are," Sharptooth said, "Lord of House Potter by birthright. Lord of House Peveril by bloodline inheritance, direct descent from Ignotus Peveril through the paternal line." He unrolled the sealed scroll, and the wax seals broke themselves as it opened, 7 of them in sequence, each one releasing a small burst of light. "Lord of House Black, in accordance with the last will and testament of Sirius," Harry said, turning. Sirius was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and an expression that Harry recognized as the carefully maintained surface calm of someone trying very hard not to look emotional about something. "I filed it last year," he said. "After the war ended and I was officially, well, me again. I filed it quietly because I didn't want to make a thing of it." "Sirius, you're not, I'm not dying, no. But the lordship can be transferred between living holders if the holder chooses and the recipient is a blood relation." Sirius's jaw moved. "You're the closest thing I have to a son, Harry. And the black lordship in your hands is safer than it is in mine. I'm not exactly a political animal. You are. I'm really not. You became one," Sirius said, "whether you wanted to or not. The war made you one. Let the lordship mean something." Harry held his gaze for a moment, reading the certainty there, and then nodded. "Once. Okay." Sharptooth continued. "House Gryffindor," he said, and there was a slight shift in the room's atmosphere, the way air changes before lightning. "Dormant for 412 years. Direct descent through the paternal line of House Potter, which carried the Gryffindor bloodline from the late 15th century. The blood accounting confirms the qualifying connection." He looked up. "You are Lord of House Gryffindor." Ron made a sound. It wasn't quite a word. Hermione's quill had stopped moving. "That's 4, Harry said, because keeping count seemed like the most practical thing to do. "That is 4, Sharptooth agreed. His expression did the thing again, the not quite reverence. "There are more. We will come to them in sequence. But first," he set down the scroll and picked up the carved wooden box. "There is the matter of the Evans genealogy." The box opened on its own when Sharptooth touched it, which Harry was beginning to accept as a motif for the morning. Inside was a single folded document, and beside it, a small portrait, miniature, no larger than a playing card, of a woman with dark red hair and green eyes, sitting at a desk and writing, the way people in portraits did when they'd been painted mid-task. Harry picked up the portrait. The painted woman looked up from her work. She looked at him. Her expression went through several things very quickly: shock, recognition, a joy so sudden and intense it changed her whole face, and then she pressed one hand over her mouth, and Harry had to look away. "That's Lily," Sirius said, very softly. "Yeah," Harry said. He set the portrait gently on the table in front of him and opened the document. The Evans genealogy was 43 pages long and covered roughly 900 years. Lily Potter had commissioned it from the Goblin Genealogists Guild in 1979, 2 years before her death. She had been 21 years old. She had known, Harry realized, not necessarily about everything that would happen, not about Voldemort's specific plans or the prophecy or any of the things that had come after. But she had known enough. She had known she was carrying something in her blood that mattered, and she had known enough to protect it. Hermione had taken the document and was reading with the speed and focus she brought to everything important, her eyes moving across the pages quickly, her quill making small, rapid notations. "Emery's," she said. Quietly, but with a quality in her voice that made everyone look at her. "Harry." The Evans family line traces back, through several maternal divergences in the 12th century, to an Emery's bloodline. House Emery's. She looked up, and there was something in her expression that was beyond excited, past academic interest, into the territory of genuine awe. "Harry, Emery's is, in Old Welsh magical tradition, the Emery's bloodline is, it's Merlin's," Harry said. He didn't know how he knew. It wasn't in anything he'd read. It came from somewhere below thought, from the part of him that had always responded to magic with something more instinctive than learning. He'd felt it when he touched the blood stone. He felt it now, looking at his mother's portrait, at the red hair and the green eyes that he'd inherited, at the stubborn, brilliant woman who had been 21 years old and quietly laying the groundwork for her son's survival. The miniature portrait of Lily lowered her hand from her mouth and looked at him with an expression so full it was almost unbearable. She nodded. "It's Merlin's line," Hermione confirmed. Her voice was not quite steady. "The Evans line carries Emery's blood." "Which means, through Lily, House Emery's," Sharptooth said. "Confirmed by blood accounting. And through the Emery's connection, the twin house claim," he paused. "House Merlin. Dormant since the 13th century. Claimable only by a holder of the Emery's blood who additionally carries the Peveril lineage and demonstrates the specific magical signature that the original Merlin Accord requires." He looked at Harry. The stone identified that signature. "That's 6, Harry said. 7, Sharptooth corrected. He reached into the box and produced one final document, this one sealed with a wax the color of old bronze, stamped with a seal that Harry didn't recognize, a sword and a dragon, entwined. House Pendragon. The oldest house in British magical record. It has not had an active lord in 640 years. The conditions for its claim are," he stopped. "Set the document down. Extraordinary. I will not detail them here. The claiming of House Pendragon requires a physical visit to the seat and the completion of a covenant trial. It cannot be done from a bank." "But I qualify," Harry said. "Not a question." The blood accounting, Sharptooth said, was very clear. "Yes. You qualify." The room was silent. Harry sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the goblin fire lights casting their green-gold shadows across the stone. He thought about a boy in a cupboard under the stairs who had been told he was worthless and unwanted and ordinary. He thought about years of that. The particular kind of damage it does, to be told you are nothing for so long that you begin to wonder if it might be true, even as something in you persists in refusing to believe it. He thought about Petunia, who had been afraid of all of this, who had carried it anyway, who had signed and sealed and lodged and protected it for 16 years. Who had almost burned it 3 times. Who hadn't? "All right," Harry said, bringing his gaze back down. "Walk me through the claiming process. All of it. And then tell me about the 21 days. Sharptooth looked at him with that almost reverent expression again. "How did you know about the 21 days? Because ancient inheritance law always has a deadline, Harry said, and the most dramatic thing you could do is give someone 21 days to either claim their entire legacy or lose it. Whoever wrote the 1203 Accords was clearly someone who understood that power without urgency gets taken for granted. There was a pause. And then Sharptooth did something Harry had never seen a Gringotts goblin do in his entire time dealing with them. He smiled. 21 days from the activation of the blood seal, Sharptooth confirmed. Which occurred at the moment of Petunia Dursley's death. The seal activation and the ministry notification were simultaneous. The Department of Magical Records timestamp confirms that the blood magic activated at 11:47 p.m. on the 14th of July. He produced a small brass timepiece from his robes and glanced at it. It is currently 9:23 a.m. on the 15th. You have 20 days and approximately 22 hours remaining to claim 7 outstanding lordships. 8, Harry said. Potter was already mine. 7 remaining. Correct. And if I don't claim them all within the deadline? Any unclaimed house reverts to dormancy and cannot be reactivated within a period of 100 years. Right. Harry looked at Hermione. She was already organizing her notes, her expression the efficient, determined look of someone building a plan. He looked at Ron, who had been quiet throughout but whose jaw was set and whose eyes were alert. He looked at Sirius, who was watching him with an expression that was equal parts pride and something else, the complicated tenderness of a man who had missed 12 years and was trying to make up for it simply by being fully present for everything that came now. Harry picked up Lily's portrait from the table. The miniature woman looked up at him, patient and steady. I have a question, he said quietly, to the portrait. Just one. Lily Potter inclined her head. Did you know, he said, when you commissioned this, did you know how much of it there was? The portrait tilted its head, a gesture so like the way Hermione looked at a problem that it startled him. Then Lily lifted her quill, turned to a blank edge of the painted parchment she'd been working on, and wrote 4 words in her careful script. I trusted you'd be enough. Harry looked at that for a long time. Then he tucked the portrait carefully into the inside pocket of his robes, against his heart, and stood up. Sharptooth, he said, I need a complete list of claiming protocols for each remaining house, a map of the physical seats we'll need to visit, and any relevant documentation on the Pendragon Covenant trial. He turned to Hermione. I need everything you can find on the 1203 Accords, the Merlin bloodline connection, and any existing political relationships between the 8 houses. Today. Already started, she said. Ron straightened. I need you to quietly get word to Neville. Don't put it in a letter, go to him directly. Tell him it's urgent and that it's the good kind. The good kind, Ron repeated. Right. Why Neville? Because Neville Longbottom is Lord Longbottom and has been for 2 years, and he knows the political landscape of the old houses better than any of us. And because, Harry paused, following an instinct he'd learned to trust. Because I have a feeling his house is going to matter before this is over. He picked up his dragonhide jacket from the back of the chair, pulled it on, and was halfway to the door when a sharp sound stopped him, not a voice, but the brass bell above Gringotts' entrance hall chiming, which meant an official message had just been filed with the bank. Sharptooth crossed to a brass tube on the wall, extracted a small scroll, and read it. His expression shifted. That almost reverent look curdled into something more guarded. What is it? Harry asked. The ministry, Sharptooth said, has been notified. They received their copy of the blood seal activation at the same time you received yours. It is standard protocol under the Accords. A flag has been placed on your accounts by the Department of Magical Oversight. They're already moving, Sirius said, something dark moving across his face. They're going to challenge the claims, Hermione said. It wasn't a question either. Her voice had gone flat and analytical. They'll argue procedural irregularities, try to slow down the Wisengamot recognition, anything they can do to let the 21 days run out before you've secured everything. Then we'll move faster than they do, Harry said. He looked back at Sharptooth. "Can Gringotts formally register the 4 claims I already hold, Potter, Peveril, Black, Gryffindor, before the end of today? Even if the Ministry flags it, a Gringotts registration is older law than anything they can use to block it." Sharptooth's expression shifted a third time. Pure professional satisfaction, this time. "It can be done by noon," he said. "Do it." Harry turned back to the door. "And Sharptooth, whoever put that flag on my accounts. I want to know which office it came from, and whose signature is on it." "That," Sharptooth said, "will cost extra. Send the bill to Vault 687. That's the new account you're about to open for House Peveril, which should have enough in it to cover the inquiry without anyone noticing." He glanced back with a look that wasn't quite a smile. "I've been in this bank enough times to know how it works." Sharptooth made a sound that, from anyone else, Harry would have called a laugh. "By noon, Lord Potter." Harry walked out of the small stone room and back through the corridor, with Sirius on his left and Hermione and Ron falling into step behind him. The letter was still folded in his inner pocket, next to Lily's portrait. The one Petunia had written. "Whatever I failed her in life, I will not fail her son in this." He had been failed plenty of times by plenty of people. He was no longer particularly interested in holding that against them. But he was also, he decided, finished with the part of his life where he was the thing that happened to other people's plans. Voldemort's plan. Dumbledore's plan. The Ministry's plan. The Dark Family's plan. He was done being the piece that other people moved. The great doors of Gringotts opened before them as they reached the entrance hall, and the morning light of Diagon Alley came flooding in, gold and ordinary and full of people going about their day with no idea that something was shifting. Harry stepped through the doors into the light. He had 20 days. He had 4 houses already. He had Sirius at his shoulder and Hermione's brain already working through the angles and Ron's steady, unquestionable presence at his back, and somewhere in his pocket, his mother's handwriting saying "I trusted you'd be enough." He wasn't frightened. He was, if he was being honest with himself, something closer to the opposite. The tight, compressed feeling he'd been carrying since the war, the sense of a story not yet finished, of power without direction, of grief without resolution, it was unwinding into something purposeful. Something clear. He had 20 days to claim the rest of what was his. To stand in front of 7 ancient houses and say "Here I am, and here I stay." He intended to do it in 10. Somewhere in the Ministry of Magic, an office had just flagged his accounts. Somewhere, someone was calculating how to stop him. They had no idea, Harry thought, how long he'd been waiting for a fight where he already had the advantage. He turned left toward the leaky cauldron, pulled out his wand to hail a ministry-licensed FLU connection, and said, "Okay. Let's talk about House Slytherin." Behind him, Ron made a sound that was half groan and half laugh. "Had to be Slytherin next, didn't it?" he said. "Couldn't be something normal." "Nothing about this," Harry said, "has ever been normal." He grinned at his best friend over his shoulder, bright and real and completely unafraid, and stepped into the fire. Chapter 2, The Weight of Crowns. The thing about Daphne Greengrass was that she never went anywhere she hadn't already mapped 3 exits from. Harry learned this about her approximately 4 minutes after she sat down uninvited at his table in the leaky cauldron, ordered a tea she clearly didn't intend to drink, and looked at him with the calm, assessing expression of someone who had been watching him since he walked in and had decided, after careful consideration, that he was worth talking to. He'd been sitting with Sirius, Hermione, and Ron, working through Hermione's notes on the 1203 Accords, when the chair across from him simply scraped back and Daphne Greengrass settled into it like she'd been invited. She was dressed in Muggle clothes, dark trousers, a grey shirt, which was either deliberate camouflage or a statement, and she set a small sealed envelope on the table between them without a word. Harry looked at the envelope. Then at her. "Greengrass," he said. "Potter," she said. "You look surprised to see me. You shouldn't be. You've been in Gringotts all morning, half the bank saw you leave with a goblin accounts master, and the rumor has already moved through the alley faster than you walked from the bank to here." She wrapped both hands around her teacup but didn't lift it. "I came to make you an offer before anyone less civilized gets to you first." "We haven't spoken since 6th year," Harry said. "You told me Slytherin would beat Gryffindor at Quidditch and I told you you were wrong, and then you were right, and neither of us brought it up again." "That's more than most people can say," she said, which was, irritatingly, true. Daphne Greengrass had always been something of a ghost in his peripheral vision at Hogwarts, present, precise, never quite where you expected her. She'd stayed out of Umbridge's business in 5th year. She'd stayed out of the Carrow's business in 7th year, which required a specific kind of political skill that Harry had only come to appreciate in retrospect. She had never worn a dark mark. She had also never, to his knowledge, done anything heroic. She had simply survived, which in the years they'd shared at school had sometimes required more intelligence than heroism. "House Greengrass," Hermione said, not looking up from her notes, "is not one of the 8 houses in the blood accounting." "No," Daphne agreed. "It isn't. But House Greengrass is politically allied with 3 of the families currently making noise in the Wizengamot about the ministry flag on Potter's accounts, and I have information about who put it there and why." She pushed the envelope slightly forward. "That's a summary. The full version requires a conversation." Harry looked at the envelope for another moment. Then he reached out and picked it up. "How did you know about the flag?" Sirius asked. There was no hostility in his voice, just the direct, assessing quality of a man who had spent 12 years with nothing but time to learn how to read people. "My father received a communication from the Department of Magical Oversight at 8 this morning," Daphne said. "Requesting the Greengrass family's formal position on the activation of the Potter inheritance accords and whether House Greengrass would support a ministry motion to challenge the claiming timeline." She paused. "He hadn't decided yet when I left the house. I decided for him. By coming here," Harry said. "By coming here." He opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of parchment covered in precise, small handwriting. Names. Office designations. A list of Wizengamot seats and how they were currently aligned. And at the bottom, circled, one name, Lord Arcturus Knott. Department of Magical Oversight, Informal Advisory Council. Harry set the parchment on the table where Hermione and Sirius could read it. Ron leaned over to look and made a quiet, thoughtful sound. "Knott," Harry said. "Senior." "Arcturus Knott," Daphne confirmed. "Not Theodore's father, that's Thaddeus. Arcturus is the grandfather. He's 73 years old, he has never held an official ministry position in his life, and he has more actual influence over Wizengamot proceedings than the minister himself. He's been building his position for 40 years. Quietly. Patiently." She finally lifted her tea, took one measured sip, and set it back down. "He doesn't like loud gestures. He doesn't like obvious power. He prefers to own the people who hold the power. And my inheritance," Harry said, "is a loud gesture. 8 noble houses coming under the control of one lord? It's the loudest thing that's happened in British magical politics in 6 centuries. Knott has spent his entire adult life ensuring that power stays distributed among the old families, specifically among the families that owe him favors. A single lord with 8 seats changes everything. It makes his network irrelevant." She looked at him steadily. "He will try to stop you. Not with violence. He's far too clever for that, especially with your profile. He'll use procedure. Bureaucracy. Timeline delays. He needs just enough days to run out the Accords clock." "How many Wizengamot votes does he control?" Hermione asked. "Directly?" 12. "Through intermediaries and family obligations?" "Potentially 26. "And how many does the ministry need to formally challenge an ancient claim?" Daphne looked at Hermione with what might have been the beginning of respect. 20. Hermione wrote something in her notebook with particular emphasis. Harry watched her and let the silence sit for a moment while he thought through what Daphne had told them. It was good information, detailed, specific, and delivered quickly, which meant either she was completely trustworthy or she was the opening move of something more complicated. "Why are you here?" he asked. Directly, because Daphne Greengrass struck him as someone who appreciated directness. The real reason. She looked at him without blinking. "Because House Greengrass has been in Knott's political network for 11 years, and my father is not a bad man but he is a cautious one, and his caution has made us useful to people we should never have been useful to. I am tired of it." The words were flat and certain in the way of something that had been thought through a long time ago. "And because whatever Harry Potter's inheritance becomes, politically, it will be better for my family's interests than whatever Arcturus Knott's continued dominance looks like." That's a practical answer. I'm a practical person. Are you asking for an alliance? She considered. I'm offering information with the implicit understanding that if it proves useful, and if your ascension looks like it's actually going to succeed, we'll discuss what comes next. She stood, smoothing her jacket. I'm not asking for anything today. Today I'm just someone who happened to sit down in a public place and have a conversation. She left. Her tea was barely touched. Harry watched her go, then looked back at the table. Sirius was reading the parchment with narrowed eyes. Hermione was making connections between her notes and the list of names. Ron was looking at the door Daphne had left through with a thoughtful frown. What do you think? Harry asked the table generally. She's not lying, Sirius said. The Knott name is, I know it. Arcturus Knott and my grandfather were in the same circles. He's exactly what she described. Patient, indirect, and absolutely ruthless in the way of people who never have to get their hands dirty. He looked up. He'll be a problem. He'll be a problem we handle when we get to him, Harry said. Right now I need to get to House Slytherin before the Ministry figures out how to complicate it. He looked at Hermione. Tell me about the claiming process. What actually happens? Hermione set down her quill. For most of the houses, the claiming process is relatively straightforward. You present yourself at the ancestral seat, you perform a blood acknowledgement ritual, and the house magic recognizes the lord. Simple enough that it can be done in an afternoon. She paused in a way that meant the next part was not simple. For House Slytherin, it's different. The seat is Slytherin Hall in the Somerset Marshes. It's been unoccupied since the late 1600s. But the claiming trial isn't just a blood ritual. It's an active magical assessment. The house tests the claimant. Tests them for what? Worthiness, she said, and something in her expression said she found the word both accurate and slightly absurd. Specifically, it tests for Parseltongue, which you have, and for what the old texts call the will to command. Which is, she looked at her notes. Less clearly defined. But the historical accounts of the last person to attempt the claim, in 1743, describe it as a trial that responds to confidence and intention. You can't pass it by performing correctly. You pass it by meaning it. That, Ron said, sounds exactly like the kind of test Harry would ace. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Harry said, though he didn't particularly mean it as a caution. Can we get to Somerset by tonight? There's a flu point in a village called Aller, Hermione said. 20 minutes from the hall. Then tonight. Harry stood, gathering the notes. But first, Sirius, the Black Lordship transfer. You said you filed it last year. Is there anything we need to do to formalize it? Any ceremony or seal? Sirius reached into his jacket and produced a small leather document case, worn but well kept. Already have it. The formal transfer document. I had Gringotts draw it up the same time I filed the will. He passed it across the table. Sign it, blood seal it, and it's done. Harry opened the case, took the quill Hermione offered, and signed his name at the bottom of the document without hesitation. Then he pressed his right thumb to the seal mark at the bottom corner. The golden flare of magic was brief and warm, and then it settled. The Black Lordship settled with it, not like a weight dropping onto him, but like a door opening in a room he'd always known was there. A sense of recognition, deep and quiet. He thought about Grimmauld Place and its groaning pipes and its dark library, about the tapestry with its burned-out names, about a house that had held so much ugliness and was now, slowly, becoming something else. "Right," he said. "That's 5 confirmed. 4 at Gringotts by noon and this one by signature," Sirius said. "Sharptooth will have it on record before close of business." Harry nodded. "Hermione, I need you to reach out to Luna this afternoon." She looked up. "Luna? Why?" "Because Sharptooth mentioned the Merlin Accord requires a specific magical signature verification, and the historical accounts of that claiming process are apparently," he paused, sorting through what Sharptooth had told them, "unusual. Luna reads unusual better than any of us. Tell her it's about an old vault and that I need her particular way of looking at things." Hermione opened her mouth in a way that suggested she wanted to point out that there were more conventional research avenues, and then closed it and wrote in her notebook instead, because she'd known Harry long enough to know that his instincts about people were rarely wrong. "And Neville?" Ron asked. "I sent a Patronus from Gringotts," Harry said. "He should meet us at Grimmauld Place by this evening. We'll brief him before we go to Somerset." They were on their feet and moving before Harry had finished the sentence, which was exactly the kind of team they were, not a group that needed to be organized so much as one that needed to be pointed in a direction and then trusted to accelerate. Neville was waiting at Grimmauld Place when they arrived back at noon, sitting in the kitchen with a mug of tea and the careful, watchful composure of someone who had learned, sometime in the last 2 years, that patience was its own form of power. He'd changed since school in ways that were difficult to quantify. He was the same Neville, the same steady eyes, the same fundamental decency that radiated off him like warmth from a banked fire, but the softness that had made him easy to overlook was gone. What was underneath had always been there. Now it was just visible. Harry sat down across from him, declined the tea, and told him everything. Neville listened without interrupting, which was its own particular skill. When Harry finished, Neville was quiet for a moment, turning his mug slowly in his hands. 8 houses, he said. 7 remaining to claim. In 20 days. 19 now. Neville nodded slowly. "And you want my help because of the Longbottom seat." "House Longbottom has held political standing in the Wisengamot for 400 years, Harry said. "Your grandmother had 13 favors called in during the war and didn't collect on any of them. You've been quietly building relationships with the moderate families since you took the lordship at 15. You understand the political architecture of the old houses better than I do." He leaned forward. "I don't need you to manage the politics for me. I need you to tell me which houses in that architecture are going to have a problem with what I'm doing, and why." Neville looked at him steadily, and then something eased in his expression, not relief, exactly, but the particular quality of someone who's been asked to do something real rather than to stand in the background and be supportive. "Okay," he said. "The families that will have a problem break into 2 categories. The first are the ones who have active territorial relationships with the dormant houses, families who've been treating the absence of a lord as permission to expand their own influence. Claiming those houses means re-establishing boundaries they've been quietly ignoring." "Which houses?" "Gryffindor and Slytherin, primarily. House Gryffindor's ancestral territories in Wales and the Scottish borders have been informally claimed by the Macmillan and Fawley families respectively. Nothing official, they haven't been stupid enough to formally register it, but they've been operating there for decades and they won't be happy to have a lord standing up to assert ownership." "They'll have to be unhappy then," Harry said. "The second category," Neville continued, "are the families who are philosophically opposed to any single lord holding multiple seats. The Wisengamot is built on balance. Every family with a seat has a vote, and those votes balance each other. 8 seats under one lord doesn't just change the numbers, it changes the principle. Some of them will have a legitimate point, Hermione said from the other end of the table, where she'd been reading and occasionally contributing. The constitutional argument isn't entirely without merit. Multi-seat concentration has historically been a precursor to authoritarian, Hermione, Harry said. I'm just saying it's a real argument and they'll make it. They can make it, Harry said. That doesn't mean they win. The 1203 Accords are legitimate law, older law than the Wiesengemot itself. Anyone challenging multi-seat inheritance would have to repeal the Accords, which would mean reopening the entire Blood Covenant, which would destabilize every inheritance in British magical law. He looked at Neville. Is Arcturus not going to try to use that argument? Neville considered. Nott is too smart for that. He won't go after the Accords directly. He'll go after the individual claims, find procedural defects, challenge the blood accounting evidence, argue that the Gringotts methods don't meet modern evidentiary standards. He paused. He'll also go after the Merlin and Pendragon claims specifically, because those are the ones with no living witnesses and the most archaic documentation. He'll make those as messy as possible. Which is why we need to claim them cleanly and quickly, Harry said. Before he has time to build the procedural case. He stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the narrow, grey Grimmauld Place street. A Muggle postman was walking past. 2 pigeons sat on the opposite roofline. Completely ordinary, and something enormous was shifting underneath it. There's one more thing, Neville said, behind him. Harry turned. Neville's expression had changed. Something more personal had come into it, something slightly uncomfortable in the way of a truth that isn't easy to say. The Longbottom family records, he said. I was going through them last spring, nothing specific, just getting familiar with the house history. And there's a reference in there. From 1204, just after the Accords were written. He reached into his jacket and produced a small, folded piece of parchment, a photocopy of something older. A record of an oath. House Longbottom swore a guardian oath to House Pendragon in 1204. 1 year after the Accords. The oath states that Longbottom will serve as protector and witness for any legitimate Pendragon claimant. He set the parchment on the table. I think that oath is still active. The room was very quiet. Harry walked back to the table and picked up the parchment. The copy was clear enough to read the old-fashioned script. He could feel something in the words, not magic exactly, not like the bloodstone, but the resonance of an oath that had been made and kept and was still, centuries later, waiting. If I claim Pendragon, Harry said, you'd be bound by that oath. I'd be honored by it, Neville said, with a simplicity that made the words mean more than any elaboration could have. Harry. I was at the Battle of Hogwarts. I stood up when it mattered because you'd been standing up my whole life without knowing I was watching. An oath my house made 800 years ago doesn't feel like a burden to me. Harry looked at him for a long moment. Okay, he said. Then come to Somerset tonight. Neville picked up his mug and took a calm sip of tea. I was going to whether you invited me or not. Ron snorted. The afternoon moved quickly. Hermione produced a research summary by 3 o'clock that covered the Somerset location, the Slytherin Hall claiming protocols, and a linguistic breakdown of the Parseltongue phrases required for the blood acknowledgement ritual, which she'd translated with academic precision and which Harry read over and found he could already feel the shape of in the back of his throat, the way Parseltongue always felt, like thinking in water. At 4 o'clock, a message arrived from Gringotts. Sharptootha's handwriting, brief and precise, for claims registered as of 12:03 p.m. Ministry flag acknowledged and entered into record. Flag origin, Office of Magical Oversight, authorized by Senior Advisor Arcturus Nott. Counter-record filed per your instruction. Harry showed it to Sirius. Sirius read it with a smile that had nothing warm in it. He's already filed his position. That means he's claiming the right to formally object when you begin the claiming process. He's trying to create a legal trail. Let him, Harry said. Every piece of paper he files becomes evidence of deliberate interference with legitimate inheritance law. The older the law he's fighting, the worse it looks for him. He folded the message. He's used to people who back down when the bureaucracy gets heavy. He has no idea what he's dealing with. He's about to, Sirius said. The message came from Luna at 5:30. It arrived on a pale gray owl Harry didn't recognize, written in Luna's distinctive looping hand on paper that had small pencil drawings of what appeared to be atmospheric fish in the margins. Harry, how wonderful. I've been dreaming about a stone vault with a sword on the door for 3 weeks and wondering what it meant. I'll meet you wherever you need. I've already packed. Bring something warm. Ancient magical sites are frequently cold regardless of the actual weather, because the magic is very old and has had a lot of time to develop opinions. Love, Luna. Harry read it twice. He was never entirely sure whether Luna was occasionally clairvoyant or simply observed things so carefully that she appeared to be. He'd stopped wondering about the distinction. He showed it to Hermione, who read it, looked at the fish drawings, and said, "The sword on the door is the Merlin Vault seal." How does she know about the Merlin Vault? She doesn't, Harry said. She dreamed it. Hermione pressed her lips together in the way she did when confronted with something that didn't fit neatly into her frameworks. Right, she said. Fine. Good. They reached Aller at 8:30 in the evening, coming out of the floor one by one into the back room of a village pub that served as the local magical transit point. The pub was called the King's Sedge, and it had the pleasant, unhurried atmosphere of a place that had been in exactly the same spot for 400 years and had no particular intention of changing. The barman, a round-faced wizard with flour on his hands who was clearly also the baker, gave them a look that suggested they weren't the first unusual group to come through. Slytherin Hall, he said, when Harry asked for directions. If you know it. The barman considered them all, Harry, Hermione, Ron, Sirius, Neville, with an expression somewhere between curiosity and wariness. Nobody goes there, he said. The wards will let me through, Harry said, pleasantly. Which way? The barman pointed south, gave them a description of the path, and then watched them leave with the expression of a man who intended to have an interesting story for his regulars later. The Somerset marshes in July were warm and very green, all flat land and wide sky, with water cutting through the grass in black glittering lines. There was a particular quality to the light here in the evening, golden and diffuse, the sun low and unhurried. Under other circumstances, Harry thought, it would have been quite beautiful. They followed the path south for 20 minutes, moving through land that shifted gradually from cultivated fields into something older. The grass grew longer. The path narrowed. The air had a quality to it that Harry recognized from places like Hogwarts and the Department of Mysteries, the particular density of air that has had magic in it for a very long time. He felt the wards at 500 meters. Not as a barrier, they hadn't tried to stop him. More like a recognition, the same warm gold awareness he'd felt at the Gringotts door. Something very old identifying him and deciding he was expected. Neville made a quiet sound beside him. You feel that? Yeah. I've visited 47 ancestral sites in the last 2 years, Neville said. For research, mostly. Some of them had wards this strong. He paused. None of them felt like they were glad someone was coming. The hall appeared out of the marsh grass the way things appeared when they'd been hidden for a very long time, not gradually, not dramatically, but all at once, as though it had simply decided to be visible. It was not what Harry had expected. He'd had a vague image of something crumbling and dark, consistent with the Slytherin aesthetic as he understood it from his years at Hogwarts. But Slytherin Hall was low and long and built of a pale stone that had gone grey-green with age and weather, and in the evening light it looked less sinister than ancient. Permanent. Patient. A serpent was carved above the entrance door. Not the exaggerated heraldic serpent of the Hogwarts coat of arms, something more naturalistic, coiled and watchful, and as Harry looked at it, it moved. Right, Ron said, from slightly behind his left shoulder. Moving snake. Fine. The serpent oriented toward Harry. It opened its mouth, and what came out wasn't a hiss so much as an expectation, a shaped silence, the Parseltongue equivalent of "Who are you?" Harry answered in the same language, and it was not a performance or an act of will. It was simply what he said when something asked him, in the oldest possible terms, who he was. "I am Harry Potter, heir of Slytherin's line by blood and right of conquest. I have come to claim what is mine." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then the door opened. "That was quick," Hermione said. "I think it was waiting," Harry said. The inside of the hall was cold and dark and smelled of old stone and something green and sharp, like cut herbs or standing water. The walls carried carvings similar to the entrance, serpents and interwoven knotwork, and in the fireplace, which was enormous and carved from a single piece of black stone, a fire had come alight on its own. It was green gold, and it lit the room in a way that should have been unsettling and was instead simply very old. The claiming trial, as Hermione had described it, was supposed to be a test of will to command. Harry had been turning this phrase over since Gringotts and was still not entirely sure what it meant in practice. He stood in the center of the hall and waited for the test to announce itself. It didn't announce itself. It simply began. The fire went out. Not slowly, between one breath and the next, the room was entirely dark, and then it was not a room at all but something else. Harry's feet were on the ground, or a surface that behaved like ground, but the walls had been replaced by an open dark space, and in the dark, something moved. Shapes. Not threatening, not immediately. They were memories, he realized. The hall's memories. Every person who had stood in this space in the 600 years since Salazar Slytherin built it and charged it with the intent that power should belong to those who earned it. Every person who had tried and failed, who had flinched from the dark, who had come seeking authority they hadn't yet grown into. The shape stopped moving. The darkness had a presence to it. A question that didn't use words but that Harry felt as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud: "Why should you have this?" Not a warm question. Not an invitation. A genuine challenge, carrying the weight of centuries and the specific, cold intelligence of a man who had built his house on the principle that sentiment was a weakness and power was the only honest currency. Harry thought about it for exactly 1 second. Then he said, aloud, in Parseltongue, "Because I have already been inside your most sacred chamber and I killed the thing you put there. Because I carry your blood without owing you anything for it. Because the line between your values and mine is not where you thought it was never about blood, it was always about power, and I understand power now in a way you never intended anyone to." He paused. "I am not here to honor your legacy. I am here to claim it and do something better with it." The darkness held for another long moment. Then the fire came back, gold and green, warm and steady. On the floor in front of the fireplace, where there had been nothing before, there was a signet ring. Silver, set with a stone the color of deep water, carved with the Slytherin crest. It hummed faintly with house magic that had been waiting for 400 years to have somewhere to go. Harry picked it up and put it on. The house magic moved through him like the tide coming in, vast and impersonal and completely unambiguous. Recognized. Lord Slytherin. He turned to face his friends, who had been standing at the edge of the room in the particular stillness of people watching something important happen. Ron looked like he wasn't entirely sure how to feel. Hermione looked like she was fighting back tears and winning. Neville looked calm and certain in a way that made Harry feel, suddenly and unexpectedly, less alone than he'd felt in a long time. Sirius stepped forward, crossed the distance between them, and put a hand on Harry's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 6, Harry said. 6, Sirius confirmed. 2 more. 2 more. Outside, the Somerset marshes settled into full dark, and the stars over the flatland were extraordinarily clear, and somewhere in London a 73-year-old man with a great deal of patience and a great deal of power was filing his third piece of procedural objection paperwork of the day, and had no idea that his window for stopping what was coming was already narrowing to something he could no longer control. Harry stood in Slytherin Hall with 5 rings warm on his hands and one principle settled firmly in the center of his chest. The world had spent 17 years deciding what to do with Harry Potter. He had spent the last 2 years deciding what Harry Potter would do with the world. The difference was not small. Chapter 3, The Serpent's Throne and the Spider's Web. The Daily Prophet ran the story on Thursday morning. Harry found out because Sirius came downstairs at 7 a.m. holding the paper at arm's length like it was something that might bite, dropped it on the kitchen table, and said, "Well, that's going to be a problem." The headline read, "Potter Inheritance Claim, Ministry Sources Question Legitimacy of Ancient Accords Activation." Below it, in slightly smaller but no less aggressive type, "Unprecedented multi-seat grab could destabilize Wizengamot balance, senior advisors." And below that, a photograph of Harry leaving Gringotts yesterday morning, which meant someone had been watching the bank or had a contact inside the alley, and had been ready with a camera before the morning was even properly started. Harry read the article standing up, jacket already on, one hand wrapped around a mug of tea. It was everything Neville had predicted the night before: procedural arguments, constitutional concerns, vague references to unnamed senior sources expressing doubt about the validity of the blood accounting methods. Arcturus Knott's name appeared twice, both times in ways designed to look incidental. Lord Knott, a respected senior figure in Wizengamot advisory circles, has indicated that the claims may warrant careful scrutiny before formal recognition is granted. Careful scrutiny. Harry set the paper down. "He wrote this," he said. "Not literally, but he fed it. Every quote, every angle, every carefully placed concern." He looked at Sirius. "He wants public opinion established before the Wizengamot meets." "That's exactly what he wants," Sirius said. "He's done this before. He did it to the Bones family in 1987, buried an entirely legitimate land claim in procedural mud until the family gave up and settled for a quarter of what they were owed. He did it to 2 Muggle-born families in the 90s who tried to formally register house magic they'd inherited. He's very good at making legitimate things look suspicious." "Then we give him less time," Harry said. "Neville. Where is he?" Neville looked up from the other end of the table, where he'd apparently spent the night. There was a blanket folded over the back of his chair and a second empty mug in front of him, suggesting he'd been up early and was fueled accordingly. He had the Longbottom family records spread across the table in front of him and had been working through them with the systematic patience that was one of his most underestimated qualities. "I heard you," he said. "And I've been thinking about that." He turned one of the records to face Harry. "Look at this. The Wizengamot session schedule. There's a formal sitting in 6 days. Standard business, land registrations, a couple of minor inheritance filings, nothing significant. But if you walk in with confirmed claims on 6 houses and file for Wizengamot recognition, the sitting has to address it under the Accords. They can't defer it. The law is clear." 6 days, Hermione said from the doorway, where she'd appeared with her hair still slightly wild from sleeping and her notebook already in hand, which Harry had long ago accepted as simply how Hermione worked. "That's workable if we get Merlin and Emery's before then. Those are the 2 Knott will use to muddy the legal picture most. If they're confirmed and registered by the time we walk into the Wizengamot, he loses his strongest procedural argument." "Luna's here," Ron said, coming down the stairs behind her. "Well, she arrived while you were all sleeping. She let herself in somehow. I found her in the library at 2 in the morning. She'd reorganized the entire east shelf by subject and found 3 books Sirius didn't know he had." Sirius blinked. "How did she get in?" "The wards are, apparently," Ron said, with the expression of someone who had stopped questioning certain things. "She knocked and the door opened. She thinks the house liked her." Harry moved to the library. Luna was sitting cross-legged on the window seat with a book open across her lap, not one of the Black family's darker volumes but an old, slim thing with a green cover that Harry didn't recognize. She was wearing robes the color of morning fog and had a pencil tucked behind each ear and a third one in her hand. She looked up when Harry came in with the unhurried quality of someone who had been expecting him and wasn't in any rush. "Harry," she said warmly. "The house has very good magic. Sad in the walls still, but it's getting better. You should put more plants in." "I'll look into it," Harry said, sitting down across from her. "Ron said you found something last night." "Several things." She didn't immediately say what they were, which with Luna was never impatience but was always intention. She closed the book on her lap and looked at him with those wide, perceptive eyes that always made Harry feel slightly transparent. "Before I do, how are you? Really? Not the version you give everyone else." Harry considered deflecting and then didn't. This was Luna. "It's strange," he said. "I've been told I was nothing for most of my life by one group of people and the most important person alive by another group, and neither of them was right, and now this, I'm sitting in the middle of something that's bigger than either of those stories and I'm trying to figure out if it fits." Luna looked at him for a moment. "It fits," she said simply. "That's what you feel, isn't it? Not the weight of it. The fit of it." He thought about the Slytherin ring warm on his finger. The way Lily's portrait had looked at him. The bloodstone going white. "Yeah," he said. "That's what it feels like." "Good," she said, and opened the green book again. "Then you're ready for what I found." She had found, in the space of one night in the Black family library, 3 separate references to the Merlin vault location that every academic source had apparently missed because all 3 were in the marginalia of unrelated texts, a notation in a 1340 treatise on warding methods, a single sentence in a family history of the Flamel line, and a small drawing in the back of a book of Old British magical geography that showed what appeared to be a landscape feature near Glastonbury. "Glastonbury," Hermione said, when Luna brought the books to the kitchen table and spread them out. Her voice had gone sharp and excited. "Of course. The Isle of Avalon, the magical resonance there is documented back to the 6th century, it's one of the strongest natural magical sites in Britain. It's also," Luna said, "where Merlin's original teaching seat was, according to the Flamel margin note. Not the Avalon of legend, the actual geographical location. There's a vault underneath what is now the ruined abbey, below the lowest excavation level. The Muggle archaeologists never got that deep because the magic discouraged them without them knowing it." "How do we get in?" Harry asked. Luna turned to the geography book and pointed at the drawing. On closer inspection it wasn't just a landscape, there were symbols worked into the sketch, subtle enough that they looked like artistic detail, deliberate enough that Harry could see the pattern once he was looking for it. "Parseltongue," she said. "Not because the vault belongs to House Slytherin, but because Merlin and Slytherin were contemporaries and the vault was warded in a magical language that the two of them shared. The Parseltongue tradition in Britain is much older than the Slytherin family. Slytherin formalized it, but he didn't invent it. So I can open it," Harry said. "You're the only person alive who can," Luna said, pleasantly. "Which is rather convenient timing, don't you think?" Harry looked at the drawing, at the symbols that now that he was looking were clearly Parseltongue, not the written kind but the older form, the one that existed before writing, that was just intent pressed into shape. He could read it the way he could read anything in that language, not by learning it but by simply knowing it, the way you know the sound of your own name. The House of Knowledge awaits the one who speaks the first language and carries the twin blood. "Twin blood," he said aloud. "Peveril and Emery's. Both of which I carry." "The vault will open for you," Luna confirmed. "And the claiming trial for Merlin and Emery's is inside. Both houses, one trial." She paused. "I think they were always meant to be claimed together. They're twin houses, like 2 sides of the same working." Hermione was making rapid connections in her notebook, her hand moving faster than her usual careful script. Merlin and his lineage kept two separate aspects of the original magical covenant, Merlin the practitioner, Emery's the bloodline. Separating them was a protection measure, so no single enemy could extinguish both with one strike. Reclaiming both simultaneously means no one can separate them again, Harry finished. Across the table, Neville had been quietly listening. "There's one more thing," he said. "About today." He folded his hands on the table in a way that meant what he was about to say had been sitting with him since last night. "Not knows you were in Somerset. I don't know how, possibly someone in Aller, possibly a watcher spell near the hall. But I received a message this morning from my grandmother. She heard from Griselda Marchbanks, who sits 3 seats from not in the Wisengamot, that there is already a formal objection being drafted to the Slytherin claim specifically." "On what grounds?" Sirius asked. "That the claiming trial cannot be independently verified," Neville said. "It's a closed magical trial with no Wisengamot witnesses. Not will argue that without ministry observers present, the claim can't be considered properly evidenced." Harry sat back. He turned this over. It was, as Daphne had said, exactly how Not operated, not confrontation but the slow, patient work of making legitimate things illegitimate through paperwork and procedure. And there was a logic to it that Harry could acknowledge without being threatened by it. You couldn't fight that strategy with outrage. You had to be smarter. "Fine," he said. "Then we bring a witness to Glastonbury. An independent one, someone the Wisengamot will have to accept. Not can't argue the trial is unverified if the verification comes from someone he can't discredit." "Who?" Ron asked. Harry thought. "Griselda Marchbanks." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Marchbanks," Sirius said slowly. "She's on the Wisengamot. She's been on it for 60 years. She examined Dumbledore for his newts. She's also one of the most respected magical law voices in Britain," Hermione said, picking up the thread. "She has no political allegiance to Not, and she has publicly stated in at least 2 interviews that she believes the ancient inheritance laws should be honored exactly as written." She looked at Harry. "She'd be the perfect witness. But she has absolutely no reason to say yes." "She has one reason," Harry said. "She's a scholar of magical law above everything else. I'm about to claim houses Merlin and Emery's, the 2 most historically significant dormant houses in British magical record. If she comes as a witness, she gets to see what no one has seen in 700 years. He stood up. "She'll say yes." He sent the message by Patronus, because Owl Post could be intercepted and the Silver Stag crossing London was a statement in itself. The reply came back within 20 minutes, carried by a small blue Patronus that Harry vaguely recognized as the magical signature of someone very old and very assured. "Extraordinary timing. I will be available this afternoon. Do not be late, I have standards." Ron laughed at the response. Harry pocketed it, feeling something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it, the specific feeling of a plan working not because you'd been clever but because you'd read the person correctly. The morning was eaten up by 2 things that had to happen before Glastonbury. The first was a message from the ministry. Not an owl, a formal ministry herald, who appeared at the front door of Grimmauld Place at 9 a.m. with a sealed document and a carefully neutral expression. The document was a formal notification that the Department of Magical Oversight had filed for a preliminary hearing on the multi-seat inheritance claim, to be scheduled at their discretion within the next 40 days. 40 days. Which was 19 days after Harry's claiming window closed. "He's done it," Hermione said, reading the document with controlled fury in her voice. "He's trying to get the hearing scheduled after your deadline. If the ministry formally calls your claims into question and schedules a hearing after the 21 days run out, they can argue the deadline passed while the claim was under legal challenge. It's a procedural trap." "Can they do that?" Ron asked. "Technically," Hermione said, "there's no provision in the Accords that explicitly prevents a ministry challenge from being used as a timeline pause. It's a gap in the law. Then we close the gap, Harry said. He looked at Neville. Neville was already thinking. We need a counter-filing. Something that forces the Wisengamot to address the claims at the regular sitting in 6 days, before the ministry hearing can be scheduled. If the Wisengamot formally recognizes the claims first, the ministry hearing becomes moot. You can't challenge what's already been formally seated. What filing would do that? A Lord's formal presence declaration, Neville said. Under the 1203 Accords, a Lord holding 3 or more active House seats has the right to formally declare presence before the Wisengamot and request immediate seating. The Wisengamot is then legally obligated to address it at the next scheduled sitting. He paused. You have 6 seats. You more than qualify. File it, Harry said. It'll take about an hour to draft properly, then start now. Neville pulled a piece of parchment toward him with the calm efficiency of someone who had, in fact, been preparing for exactly this moment, and began writing. The second thing that ate up the morning was Daphne Greengrass. She appeared again, not at the door this time but as a flu arrival, which required either that someone had given her the Grimmauld Place connection or that she'd found it herself, and when Harry looked at her expression it was clear that she'd found it herself and was not particularly apologetic about this. My father made his decision, she said, before anyone could comment on the entry method. She was slightly flushed from the flu but her composure was otherwise intact. He's siding with Not. Sirius made a sound. He hasn't filed anything yet, Daphne continued, setting her bag down on the kitchen table with the air of someone who intended to stay for a while. He's been asked to add his name to the procedural objection as a Wisengamot signatory. If he signs, that's 2 seats against you on the preliminary challenge. Not needs 18 more to reach 20. How close is he? Harry asked. As of this morning, he has 11 confirmed besides my father. He needs 7 more and he's working 4 families actively. She sat down. I told my father that if he signs that document, he will regret it. He told me that I don't understand how politics works. So I left and came here. You understand that coming here puts you in direct opposition to your father, Hermione said carefully. I understand that perfectly, Daphne said. I've been in opposition to my father's choices for 3 years. I've just been doing it quietly. Something moved in her expression, complicated and private, the look of someone who has made a decision they knew was coming and is surprised only by the relief of it. I'm done being quiet. What do you want? Harry asked, not unkindly. She looked at him directly. I want to be useful. I know things about the families Not is working that you don't know. I know their pressure points, their old grievances, the things they care more about than Not's favor. Let me help stop him from getting to 20. You want to run political interference. I'm extremely good at it. Harry looked at her for a moment. She looked back without flinching, and there was something in that steadiness that reminded him of Neville, not the same quality exactly, but the same fundamental refusal to be less than what she was. He wondered how long she'd been waiting for a situation that asked her to be more. All right, he said. Work with Neville. He's drafting a filing that goes in this afternoon, he'll tell you what we need from the political side. He stood. I need to go claim 2 ancient houses. She blinked. Just once, and very quickly, but it was the blink of someone who had expected to have to argue longer. That's it? You said you're useful. I believe you. Prove it. He picked up his jacket. And Greengrass, if you're going to use the flu, tell someone first. The corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost but not quite a smile. I'll knock next time. You already know there's a door, Harry said, and left the kitchen. Glastonbury in the afternoon was warm and busy with the particular mixture of tourists and genuine seekers that the place had always attracted, muggle and magical alike, drawn by something they could feel even if they couldn't name it. The ruined abbey sat in its grounds with the unhurried presence of a thing that had been there long before anyone currently alive and intended to be there long after. Griselda Marchbanks was waiting at the Abbey entrance when Harry arrived with Hermione, Ron, and Sirius. She was a tiny woman, ancient in the way of objects rather than people, weathered and dense with history, with sharp black eyes that took in Harry, dismissed the expected reactions, and moved straight to assessment. "You're taller than your father," she said. "And you have your mother's eyes, which everyone will have told you already, so I won't belabor the point." She looked at the Abbey grounds with the expression of someone reviewing a site they've been meaning to visit. "The vault, then." "Where?" "Below the lower excavation," Harry said. "I'll need to go ahead to open the wards." "Obviously," she said. "Lead on." They moved through the Abbey grounds and past the last point the Muggle visitors could access, into the area that the groundskeepers kept roped off and that Harry could see, now that he was looking with the part of himself that recognized magical geography, was roped off for reasons that had nothing to do with archaeology and everything to do with the fact that whatever was below that ground had spent 700 years making people feel instinctively that they should look somewhere else. The entrance was under a section of fallen wall, accessible through a gap that looked like a drainage channel, and opened, when Harry pressed his hand to the stone and spoke the words the drawing had shown him, into a staircase that descended at a shallow angle into cool, still air. Griselda Marchbanks descended without comment, stepping around stones and ducking a low beam with the matter-of-fact agility of someone who had been in more unusual places than this. The vault was at the bottom of the stairs, a single large chamber, circular, with walls of stone so old they had the quality of something geological rather than constructed. And on every surface, in the faintly luminous script of very old magic, was writing. Not English. Not Latin. Something older than both, that Harry's eyes slid away from when he tried to read it directly, but that settled into meaning when he stopped trying and simply looked. Knowledge. All of it was knowledge. The walls were a library and a testament and a working, all at once. In the center of the chamber was a stone table, and on the table were two objects, a ring of pale gold set with a stone the color of clear water, and a simple circlet of the same pale gold, unadorned except for a single word carved on its inner surface. Hermione had gone completely still beside him, the way she went still when she was in the presence of something that genuinely moved her. Ron had his hand on his wand out of habit, but his expression was open and wondering. Sirius stood near the entrance with his arms loosely crossed and the expression of a man witnessing something he will describe to people for the rest of his life. Griselda Marchbanks walked to the stone table and looked at both objects closely, professionally, without touching them. "House Merlin," she said. She pointed at the ring. "And House Emery's." "The circlet." "Both active. Both intact. This vault has been maintained by its own magic for 7 centuries without a lord." She straightened and looked at Harry. "The trial." "I know," Harry said. "Do you?" He walked to the table. The trial for Merlin and Emery's wasn't a test of worthiness in the way Slytherin's had been, wasn't a challenge or a darkness to face down. The walls told him this, in the sideways reading way of the ancient script. It was a test of knowledge and intention together. Not can you carry this power, but do you understand what it is for? He put his hands flat on the stone table, between the ring and the circlet. The knowledge on the walls moved. Not rearranging, activating. The light in the chamber shifted from stone gray to the pale gold of early morning, and the writing became legible, all at once, in a way that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with the fact that the vault had decided he could read it. He read it. It took, in clock time, about 3 minutes. In the time that it felt like inside the experience, it was considerably longer, a compressed understanding of 8 centuries of magical theory, genealogy, philosophy, and intent. The founding principles of the twin houses, that knowledge without lineage was rootless, that lineage without knowledge was hollow, and that the two together, held by someone who understood the responsibility of both, could do things that neither could do alone. Harry understood, reading those walls, why the vault had waited. Why it had kept itself and its magic intact through 700 years of history. It wasn't stubbornness. It was patience. It had known that eventually someone would come who carried both bloodlines, who could read the old language, who had been through enough to understand that power was only as good as the person wielding it, and who was willing to carry both without choosing between them. He picked up the ring and put it on. He picked up the circlet and, because it was clearly not a ring and clearly not a crown, placed it simply on the table in front of him and pressed his palm to it. The house magic of Emery's was different from anything else he'd claimed so far. Deeper and quieter and more personal, like the difference between a door opening and a room being built. Like something completing. Recognized. Lord Merlin. Lord Emery's. 8, Harry thought. I have all 8. He turned around. Griselda Marchbanks was writing in a small notebook with the focused attention of someone recording evidence that will be used in court. She finished, blotted the page, and looked up. I have witnessed the activation and acceptance of House Merlin and House Emery's by Harry James Potter, she said, formally, in the tone of someone making a declaration for the record. Both trials complete, both claimings valid under the 1203 Accords and all subsequent inheritance law. She paused. I will be available to give testimony before the Wisengamot. Thank you, Harry said. Don't thank me, she said. I came because the history is extraordinary and I intend to write about it. The sharp eyes held a glint of something that was absolutely humor. You may benefit from my testimony. I'm benefiting from the best research opportunity I've had in 40 years. We are even. Harry thought he might like Griselda Marchbanks quite a lot. There's still Pendragon, Hermione said, beside him. There's still Pendragon, he agreed. That one, I know. She was quiet for a moment. How do you feel? He looked down at his hands. 7 rings and 1 warm weight on his left wrist where the Emery circlet had resettled itself, because apparently it had decided that was where it belonged. He thought about the walls of this vault, about the weight of what he'd just received, the vast accumulated knowledge of twin houses that had waited centuries to be held. He thought about Petunia, who had almost burned a document 3 times. He thought about Lily at 21, commissioning a genealogy and hiding it in a Gringotts vault with the quiet ferocity of a woman who was going to make sure her son had everything he was owed. I feel like it fits, he said, which was the same answer he'd given Luna this morning, and was still the most accurate thing he had. Hermione looked at him for a moment and then nodded, with the warm, settled certainty of someone who had never actually doubted this. They came back up the stairs into the afternoon light of Glastonbury, into the warm Somerset air and the distant sound of tourists and the very ordinary world going on all around the extraordinary thing that had just happened. Griselda Marchbanks left them with a formal nod and a comment about the Abbey gift shop having an acceptable selection. Harry stood in the sunlight and sent a Patronus to Grimmauld Place. 8 claimed. Pendragon pending. How's the filing going? Neville's reply came back as a Patronus bear, which was Neville's, steady and unhurried and considerably larger than you expected. The voice that came with it was calm and almost satisfied. Filing submitted to the Wisengamot 20 minutes ago. It's on the schedule for the sitting in 6 days. Daphne has already spoken to 2 families Not was targeting and one of them is off his list. Harry looked at Ron and Sirius. 6 days, he said. 6 days, Sirius said. And Pendragon. Tomorrow, Harry said. Sirius looked at him for a moment, reading the certainty there, and then smiled, the real one, not the performed version, the one that reached his grey eyes and made him look, briefly, like the man he might have been if the last 15 years had gone differently. 6 days, he said again, differently this time. Warmly. You're going to walk into that Wisengamot and the whole building is going to feel it. That, Harry said, is entirely the point. The sun was dropping toward the Glastonbury hills, turning the old stone of the Abbey warm and amber, and somewhere in London a patient old man in an expensive office was counting the days he had left to stop something that had already, without his noticing, become unstoppable. Every procedural weapon he had was being matched. Every political ally he reached for was finding reasons to pause. The Wisengamot sitting was locked in. And Harry Potter had 8 houses and 5 days and absolutely no intention of slowing down. Chapter 4, What the Old Stones Remember. The message from Arcturus not arrived at 6 in the morning. Not through official channels. Not a ministry herald or a Wisengamot filing. A personal owl, old, large, the kind of bird that belonged to families who measured their history in centuries rather than decades. It landed on the kitchen windowsill at Grimmauld Place with the unhurried authority of something that had never once been ignored, and it waited while Harry untied the letter from its leg with the steady hands of someone who had decided before opening it that it would not change anything. The letter was handwritten. The script was precise and slightly archaic, the kind of handwriting that came from someone who had been taught by a tutor rather than a classroom. It was brief. Mr. Potter, I am given to understand that you have been moving quickly through what you believe to be your inheritance. I respect efficiency, if not always its application. I would like to meet, at your convenience, to discuss a matter of mutual interest. I am not your enemy. I am simply someone who understands how these things tend to end, and who would prefer a resolution that benefits all parties. My home, not Hall, Wiltshire. Today, if you are willing. Come alone, or with one companion. Come as many as you like if you prefer to make a statement rather than a conversation. Arcturus not. Harry read it twice. Then he passed it to Sirius, who read it once, set it down, and said, "Don't go." "I'm going," Harry said. "Harry, he's not going to harm me." "That's not how he works. You said it yourself, he doesn't use violence. He uses conversation." Harry poured tea, leaned against the counter. "And I want to hear what he thinks mutually beneficial looks like. Understanding what he wants tells me what he's afraid of." Sirius looked at the ceiling briefly. "Fine. I'm coming with you. I was going to ask you to." "I know. I'm coming anyway." Hermione appeared at the kitchen door at this point, assessed the situation from the letter still open on the table and the particular set of Harry's jaw, and said, "At least let me come." "He said one companion," Harry said. "He said you could bring as many as you like if you wanted to make a statement." "I don't want to make a statement. I want a conversation." "Then Sirius goes and I stay and you tell me everything the second you're back," she said, with the crisp efficiency of someone who had already accepted the argument and moved on to extracting maximum usefulness from the situation. She sat down, opened her notebook. "In the meantime, I've been up since 4. Do you want to know what I found?" Harry sat down across from her. "Tell me." She had been working through the Pendragon documentation that Sharptooth had provided, which had arrived by Gringotts courier the previous evening, a sealed package of historical records, vault location coordinates, and the Covenant trial description that Sharptooth had been too careful to detail in the bank. The records were extraordinary and Hermione's expression said she felt about them the way she felt about every piece of genuinely rare knowledge, with a fierce, protective excitement. "The Pendragon Covenant trial is unlike anything else in the claiming process," she said, turning her notebook to show him a page dense with her neat script and several diagrams. "All the other trials are essentially house magic recognition events. The house tests you and admits you. Pendragon is different. The Covenant trial isn't just about recognition. It's about the house understanding your intent. Like the Merlin Vault. More than that. The Merlin Vault asked you to understand the knowledge. Pendragon asks you to stand in the oldest magical site in Britain and make a case." She tapped the diagram. "The seat is at Camlin, the actual historical site, which is not where most Muggles think it is. It's in a valley in Cumbria, near the Lake District. The Covenant trial requires the claimant to enter the central chamber alone." She paused. "And to face what the records call the memory of kings. Which is the accumulated magical memory of every person who has ever carried the Pendragon claim. Not just the lords, everyone who shaped the house. Centuries of intention, ambition, failure, and power." She looked at him steadily. "Harry, The last person to attempt the trial was in 1380. He was described in the records as the most powerful wizard of his generation, and he came out of that chamber in 20 minutes and refused to speak about what happened inside. He never attempted the claim again. What do you think happened to him? I think, Hermione said carefully, that the accumulated memory of that house includes some extremely uncomfortable things, and that it asked him to be honest about who he was in relation to them, and that he wasn't prepared to be. Harry thought about that. And you think I will be? I think, she said, that you have spent your entire life being asked to be something, a weapon, a symbol, a sacrifice, and you've spent the last 2 years quietly figuring out who you actually are underneath all of that. I think that's exactly what the Pendragon trial is asking for. She closed her notebook. I think you're ready. I just want you to know what you're walking into. Harry looked at her across the table, at the sharp, loyal intelligence in her face, at the way she'd sat up since 4 in the morning working through ancient records because that was how she showed people she loved them. He thought about how lucky he was in the specific, quiet way he didn't say often enough. Thank you, he said. Not for the research. She knew that. She nodded once and opened her notebook again. Go see Not. Come back in one piece. We'll go to Cumbria this afternoon. Knot Hall was everything Grimmauld Place was not. Where Grimmauld Place had the dark, compressed atmosphere of a house that had held too many unhappy secrets in too small a space, Knot Hall was open and light and meticulously maintained, a country house in the Wiltshire hills that sat in its own grounds with the serenity of something that had never had to apologize for what it was. The gardens were immaculate. The stone was clean. Everything about it communicated, without shouting, that the people who lived here had always had money and had always known exactly what to do with it. Arcturus Knott met them in a sitting room off the main entrance hall. He was, as Daphne had said, 73 years old, and he looked every year of it in the way of old trees rather than old men, not weakened by age but made more substantial by it. He was tall, lean, white-haired, dressed in robes of deep charcoal gray that probably cost more than Harry's entire wardrobe. He had the face of someone who had spent a lifetime listening carefully and revealing very little. He looked at Harry and Sirius with an expression of polite interest, as though they were a particularly engaging document he'd been sent for review. Mr. Potter, he said. Not Lord Potter. The omission was deliberate and Harry noted it without reacting. Sirius. He said Sirius's name with the particular intonation of people who had known each other in a context neither of them had chosen. Old family. Old world. Arcturus, Sirius said, matching the tone exactly. They were offered tea. Harry accepted. Sirius did not. They sat across from Knott in chairs that were comfortable enough to be hospitable and formal enough to communicate that this was not a casual visit. Knott looked at Harry for a moment with those quiet, measuring eyes. You've been moving extraordinarily quickly, he said. I won't pretend otherwise. Most people, confronted with the scope of what you've apparently inherited, would need weeks simply to understand it. You've turned it into a campaign. It has a deadline, Harry said. Everything has a deadline, Knott said, pleasantly. That doesn't mean one must treat it as a race. He settled back slightly. I imagine you've been told that I am your adversary in this. That I've been filing procedural challenges and building opposition in the Wisengamot. You have been, Harry said. That's not an accusation. It's just what's happening. Knott's expression shifted slightly, a barely perceptible acknowledgement that directness had been offered and was being noted. I have been, he confirmed. Because the concentration of 8 noble house seats in a single lord has political implications that go beyond any individual and that I believe require careful management. You mean you're worried about what I'll do with them? I'm worried about what anyone would do with them, Knott said, and his voice had a quality that Harry listened to carefully, because it had the texture of something genuinely believed rather than strategically deployed. Power concentrated always becomes power misused. That's not an accusation of your character. It's an observation of historical record. It's also, Harry said, an argument that conveniently serves your particular interests, which are built on a distributed power structure where no single seat can override your network. The room was very quiet for a moment. Nott looked at him and something moved behind his eyes, not quite surprise, but the recalibration of someone who had walked in expecting a 20-year-old war hero and had found something they needed to think about more carefully. You're not what the Daily Prophet describes, he said. The Daily Prophet describes what you feed it, Harry said, without heat. Sometimes. Nott inclined his head, a fractional acknowledgement. Let me be direct with you, since you clearly prefer it. I can make the Wizengamot hearing in 6 days very difficult. I have 22 confirmed votes. The hearing will be contentious, the media will amplify every point of dispute, and the process of formal seating, even if you ultimately succeed, will be lengthy and damaging. Or? Harry said. Or you agree to a political framework that addresses the concentration concern. A council structure, the 8 House seats are held by you in title, but major decisions require consultation with a body of existing Wizengamot members. A check on the aggregate power. He folded his hands. I drop the challenges. The seating is smooth. Everyone benefits. Harry looked at him. He took his time with it, because Nott deserved a careful answer and because rushing it would suggest he hadn't actually heard the offer. He thought about what Neville had said about Nott's methods. About what Daphne had said about her father. About the 11 years the Greengrass family had spent being useful to a man whose idea of beneficial relationships ran entirely in one direction. The framework you're describing, Harry said, is not a check on power. It's a mechanism for transferring influence from 8 ancient houses to a consultation body that you would, over time, come to dominate the same way you've dominated the existing structure. He said it without anger, simply clearly. You're not offering balance. You're offering to let me keep the title while you keep the reality. Nott looked at him for a long, still moment. I'm also, Harry continued, not particularly interested in how difficult the Wizengamot hearing is. Difficult hearings are a political event. I've survived worse events than political ones. He leaned forward slightly. Here's what I'd like to offer you instead. I'm going to be seated in 6 days with 8 House claims that Griselda Marchbanks has witnessed and that are all documented beyond any procedural challenge you can mount. When I sit in the Wizengamot, those 8 seats represent 8 votes that will be cast by someone who is not interested in personal power accumulation but is very interested in whether magical Britain is governed fairly. He paused. You have 22 votes, many of which are held by obligation rather than alignment. I have 8. But 8 votes cast consistently, publicly, on principle, can shift 40-vote chambers over time by changing what the undecided seats feel is acceptable. He sat back. I'm not offering you a framework, he said. I'm telling you that what's coming is a Wizengamot that functions differently than the one you've spent 40 years building. You can position yourself against that, in which case the next 6 days become a very public demonstration of what you've been doing in those 40 years, which I will be happy to discuss openly. Or you can decide that the new structure is something you can work with. Nott was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Sirius, sitting still beside Harry, shifted slightly. You're 17 years old, Nott said finally. 18 in 4 months, Harry said. I have time. Another silence. Then Arcturus Nott did something Harry had not expected. He smiled. It was small and private and contained something that was genuinely complex, the particular smile of a chess player who has just had their entire strategy countered by a move they didn't see coming and has the self-awareness to find it, against all odds, interesting. I withdraw 3 of the procedural challenges, Nott said. As a show of good faith. That still leaves you with enough to slow the hearing. Yes, Nott said. It does. He met Harry's eyes. I am not, Mr. Potter, prepared to simply stand aside. But I am, he paused. Prepared to reconsider the ground on which I stand. It wasn't capitulation. It wasn't agreement. It was, Harry thought, the most honest thing Nott had said in the entire conversation, a man who was intelligent enough to recognize what was coming and stubborn enough not to yield to it immediately and self-aware enough to know that those two things were in conflict. Harry stood, offered his hand. Nott shook it, which was more than Harry had walked in expecting. Outside, in the Wiltshire morning, Sirius walked beside Harry to the apparition point at the end of the drive without speaking until the house was behind a curve in the road. Then he said, "That was the most uncomfortable conversation I've ever witnessed." "He's not a bad person," Harry said. Sirius glanced at him. "He's spent 40 years consolidating power in ways that actively disadvantaged people who weren't from old families." "Yeah," Harry said. "He's not a bad person and he's done bad things and those aren't mutually exclusive." He turned his collar up against the Wiltshire wind. "I don't need him to be a villain. I need him to be manageable. And he will be, eventually, because he's smart enough to recognize when the structure changes." He paused. The 3 challenges he withdrew weren't symbolic. Those were the ones targeting the Slytherin and Gryffindor claim specifically, the 2 with the least documentary evidence. "He just gave me the clearest path to the Wisengamot hearing." Sirius stared at him. "He told you which challenges he was dropping?" "He told me he was dropping 3. I knew which 3 mattered." Harry looked at him. "Daphne gave me the full list of his filings yesterday. He has 7 total. 3 against Slytherin and Gryffindor, 2 against the Merlin and Emery's claims, and 2 general constitutional objections. He dropped the specific claim challenges. He kept the constitutional ones because those are the ones with actual philosophical grounding that he genuinely believes in, not just the procedural weapons." He paused. "Which means the hearing will be about principle, not procedure. And that's a much better fight for us." Sirius was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head slowly, with a look that Harry had come to recognize as a specific flavor of pride, the kind that came with a slight ache to it, the awareness of time. "James would have loved this," he said quietly. "Watching you work. He'd have been impossible about it. He'd have bragged to everyone he met." Harry looked at him. The morning was clear and the Wiltshire hills were green and somewhere a bird was making a persistent noise in a hedge. "Tell me something about him," he said. "Not a story I already know." Sirius was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He used to leave notes in places. Not big declarations, just small things. Lily would find one in her textbook and it would just say you were right about the Transfiguration essay. I'd find one in my Quidditch kit that said that was a good catch. He noticed things and he wrote them down because he said otherwise you forgot to say them out loud." He paused. "I think about that sometimes. The things we mean to say." Harry thought about that too, walking down the country road in the morning light. "Come on," he said. "We have a valley in Cumbria to get to." They collected the others at Grimmauld Place just past noon, Hermione with a complete research file on the Camlin site, Ron with sandwiches and the calm preparedness of someone who had learned not to go anywhere with Harry without food, Neville with the Guardian Oath document that he'd had formally registered with Gringotts that morning, and Luna, who arrived with a small bag and announced that she'd brought warmth charms because old magical sites always felt cold regardless of the actual temperature and she had said so before. "You did," Harry agreed. She smiled and fell into step beside him as though she had simply always been walking there. They apparat to a point outside the Lake District village of Shap, a spare, wind-blown place where the fells rose in every direction and the sky was the particular pale grey of high altitude. From the village they walked north for 40 minutes on a path that was not on any Muggle map and that Hermione had found only in the Gringotts documentation, through terrain that grew more spare and more ancient feeling with every mile. Harry felt the Camlin site before he saw it. Not the recognition he'd felt at Slytherin Hall, something older and heavier, with an entirely different quality. The Slytherin site had felt like a question. The Merlin vault had felt like a library. This felt like, he searched for the word, walking through the last of the fells, and found it when the valley opened before them. It felt like consequence. Like the place where things had been decided and the deciding still hung in the air, permanent and unresolved. The valley was not dramatic. That was the first thing he noticed. He'd been half expecting something that looked like a film set, dramatic stones, fallen pillars, the obvious iconography of legend. Instead it was a flat valley floor surrounded by gentle fells, with a single standing stone at its center, roughly his own height, unremarkable to look at except that it had the quality of having been there so long it had become part of the landscape's intention rather than an intrusion on it. "The chamber is below the stone," Hermione said quietly, beside him. Neville stopped at the valley's edge. He looked at Harry with the particular expression he'd worn last night when he described the guardian oath, settled and certain and offering. "The oath activates when you enter the valley as a Pendragon claimant," he said. "I can feel it from here." A pause. "I'm with you, Harry. For whatever that's worth." "It's worth a great deal," Harry said. He walked into the valley alone. Not because anyone had told him to, they would have come if he'd asked. But the memory of kings was something he needed to face the way he'd learned to face everything that mattered, with no one between him and the truth of it. The standing stone recognized him at 10 meters, which he felt as a deep vibration in his chest, in the Pendragon ring on his finger that had been cold since Sharptooth gave it to him and was now, for the first time, warm. He placed his hand on the stone's surface. The valley disappeared. The chamber was not below the stone in any physical sense, it was beside reality, adjacent to the valley in the same way that Parseltongue was adjacent to ordinary language. He was standing in a space that was not dark and not lit, that had no clear walls but had the quality of enclosure, and around him, very slowly, the memory of kings began to wake. They weren't ghosts. Nothing so comfortable. They were the accumulated weight of everyone who had shaped the Pendragon legacy, the oldest magic in Britain, the covenant at the foundation of everything that came after. They had no faces, exactly, but they had presence, distinctive and individual, centuries of intention pressing through the air like light through old glass. The question came, as it had at Slytherin and at Camlin, without language. This time it wasn't "who are you" or "why do you deserve this?" It was something that Harry felt as, "what will you do with the oldest power in Britain?" He stood in the middle of it and thought about Petunia dying in a hospital bed in London, having kept a secret for 16 years because once, a long time ago, she had been a girl with a sister she loved before the world gave her too many reasons to be frightened. He thought about Lily at 21, commissioning genealogies and hiding them in vaults, doing quietly and carefully what needed doing because her son was going to need it and she was determined that he would have it. He thought about Sirius in Azkaban for 12 years, maintaining his sense of self through something that had broken stronger people, because he refused to let the Dementors take the parts of him that James and Harry were still going to need. He thought about Neville standing at the valley's edge saying "I'm with you" because 800 years ago his ancestors made a promise and he saw no reason not to honor it. He thought about the 17 years of being told he was nothing, and the 2 years of discovering that was a lie, and the last 4 days of finding out exactly how large the truth was. What will you do with the oldest power in Britain? He answered not in Parseltongue, not in any language, but in the way the space required, directly, in intention. Build something worth building. Not for the houses or the seats or the political capital. For the people who've been told the world doesn't have room for them. For the Muggle-born families who lost land claims in procedural mud while nobody fought hard enough. For every person the Ministry's careful, respectable neglect quietly destroyed. Use the power the way power is supposed to be used, as a counterweight to every system that treats the powerful as the only ones worth protecting. He paused, because honesty mattered here above everything else. And I'll probably make mistakes doing it. I'm 18 in 4 months. But I'll make them in the open and correct them, because that's the only thing I know how to do. The presences in the chamber were very still. Then the oldest of them, the deepest weight, the one that had been there before all the others, moved, and what Harry felt from it was not approval or disapproval but recognition. Pure and impersonal and enormous. The recognition of something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to simply tell the truth. The warmth of the Pendragon ring became heat and then settled back to warmth, and he was standing in the valley again, at the base of the standing stone, with the afternoon sun of Cumbria coming through a break in the clouds and landing on the stone in a long golden stripe. On the stone's surface, where his hand was pressed, something was carved that had not been there before. He had to lean close to read it, because it was small and he suspected visible only to him. Recognized. Lord Pendragon. Harry stayed at the stone for a moment. Not because he needed to. Just because the moment was large and quiet and real and deserved the time. Then he walked back across the valley floor to where his friends stood at the edge. Ron had finished his sandwiches. Hermione's eyes were bright. Neville was very still, and Harry felt, when he crossed back into the part of the valley where Neville stood, the guardian oath settle and activate. Not a burden falling on Neville, not a chain, but a connection, clean and old and right. Neville met his eyes and nodded once. Luna was looking at the sky. 8, Harry said. 8, she agreed, still looking at the sky. Luna, what are you looking at? The way the clouds are moving, she said. It's going to be a beautiful day for the Wizengamot. Atmospheric conditions are very important for formal declarations. The air should be clear and moving from the west, which means truth rather than obfuscation. She looked at him. You'll be fine. I know, he said. He did know. Not from arrogance, not from the accumulated power of 8 houses settling into him like rivers finding the sea. He knew because he'd walked into a chamber full of the oldest magic in Britain and told it the truth about himself and it had said yes, and because he had 4 people standing at this valley's edge who had been standing at every edge with him for years and hadn't yet found one that made them leave. He had 5 days. He had 8 houses. He had Griselda Marchbanks's testimony, Neville's guardian oath, Daphne's political intelligence, and 22 of Nott's votes beginning to doubt the wisdom of being against what was coming. Somewhere in London, the Wizengamot was set to meet in 5 days. Somewhere in a ministry office, people were filing documents and counter-filing documents and preparing arguments and preparing counter-arguments. Harry looked back at the standing stone once. At the ancient valley, the pale grey sky, the fells rising in every direction. At the place where things had been decided for the last time a very long time ago. He turned away and started walking back toward the road, toward Grimmauld Place and the work of the next 5 days, and his friends fell into step around him like they always did, naturally, without being asked, in the easy formation of people who had chosen each other so many times that the choosing had become simply who they were. He did not look back again. There was nothing behind him that he needed to be afraid of. Chapter 5. Before the storm breaks. The 5 days before the Wizengamot sitting were not quiet. Harry had expected busy. He had not quite expected the particular texture of busy that descended on Grimmauld Place in the 48 hours after Cumbria, a layered, pressurized kind of activity where every hour brought something new that needed immediate attention, and the new things were increasingly the kind that couldn't be solved by going somewhere and claiming something. They required patience, which Harry had, and politics, which he was rapidly learning, and the particular skill of knowing when to move and when to let someone else move and when to simply wait and let a situation resolve itself. He was getting better at all 3. He wasn't sure he liked it. Monday began with owls. 7 of them, arriving within 20 minutes of each other, which meant the senders had coordinated or had all received the same triggering news at roughly the same time. Harry was in the kitchen when they came, reading through Hermione's notes on the Wizengamot constitutional framework with a cup of tea that had gone cold. He opened the owls in order of arrival. The first was from Andromeda Tonks. Brief, warm, and to the point. I've seen the prophet. Ignore half of it. Ted sends his regards. If you need the Black family's public support from the civilian side, I'll give a statement. Just ask. Harry wrote back immediately. The second was from Arthur Weasley, which made Ron, who had come downstairs mid-delivery, go slightly pink in the way he did when something his father did moved him. Arthur's letter was characteristically Arthur, thoroughly decent and slightly rambling and absolutely sincere. It described, over 2.5 pages, his complete support for the inheritance claims, his belief that the 1203 Accords were legitimate law that deserved respect, and his particular personal happiness that someone was finally going to make the old family's political structure account for itself. He also mentioned that Molly had made a pie. "Tell your dad," Harry said, looking at Ron, "that the pie is appreciated and the letter even more so." Ron took the letter and folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, which was its own kind of answer. The third owl was from someone Harry didn't recognize, a Lord Aurelius Selwyn, whose family name Harry knew only as one that had stayed carefully neutral during the war. The letter was politely worded and carefully noncommittal and was, Harry understood after reading it twice, an inquiry about whether he would be receptive to a meeting before the Wisengamot sitting. Not a pledge of support. An interest in understanding the situation better before committing to a position. "Selwyn," Daphne said, appearing from the corridor with her own notebook and the focused look she'd been wearing since Monday, when she'd essentially moved her operational base to Grimmauld Place without anyone formally deciding this was happening. "Old family. Very old. They've been sitting on the fence since the end of the war, which in their case is strategic rather than cowardly. They have interests on both sides of most arguments. Aurelius Selwyn specifically is a swing vote on the Wisengamot. He's voted against not twice in the last 3 years. Would he vote for recognition? He might," she said. "If he feels the political situation is stable enough. He doesn't like uncertainty. He likes knowing which direction the wind is blowing before he puts his hand up." "Then I meet him," Harry said. "Today if he can. I'll arrange it." She took the letter, already turning toward the fireplace. Harry watched her for a moment, the efficiency of it, the way she'd slotted into the Grimmauld Place operation with a naturalness that suggested she'd been waiting for somewhere to apply her particular skills. She caught him watching and raised an eyebrow. Not defensively. More like acknowledgement. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're good at this." "I know," she said, without false modesty, and went to arrange the meeting. The 4th, 5th, and 6th owls were all from journalists, The Prophet, which weekly's political correspondent, and an independent magical news outfit that Harry had actually read and found occasionally reliable. He set all 3 aside for Hermione, who had developed a system for managing press contact that involved a series of form responses graduated by outlet credibility and the careful deployment of selective information. "Give them the formal claiming timeline," Harry told her. Nothing about the Wisengamot strategy. Just the facts of the inheritance. "Let the facts do the work," she said, approvingly. "The facts are extraordinary enough," he said. "Anyone reading the real story of what Lily set up, what Petunia protected, what the genealogy actually shows, that's not a procedural dispute. That's a human story. Can't fight a human story with paperwork." Hermione looked at him for a moment. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about everything," he said. "I don't sleep as much as I used to." The 7th owl was the one that changed the shape of the day. It was from Theodore Nott. Harry had not had a great deal of direct interaction with Theodore Nott during their years at Hogwarts. He was quieter than most of his house, kept his own counsel, and had the particular quality of someone who had grown up watching a parent operate in ways they weren't sure they agreed with and had learned to be very careful about what they showed. He'd never worn a dark mark. He'd never been actively cruel. He'd been present and watchful and largely silent, which in the context of wartime Slytherin had been its own form of courage. The letter was short. "Potter, my grandfather doesn't know I'm writing this. He's going to make a move before the sitting that goes beyond the procedural challenges. I don't know the specifics. I heard enough to know it's not paperwork this time. I'm not my grandfather. Not." Harry read it 3 times. Then he brought it to the kitchen table and put it in the center and let everyone read it in turn. The room was quiet for a moment after Sirius set it down. "He's credible," Neville said. "Theodore Nott has been one of the most independent thinkers in his family for years. His grandmother on the maternal side was a half-blood. Arcturus never acknowledged it publicly, but it's in the records. Theodore is not what his grandfather made him." "The warning is vague," Hermione said, with the precision of someone trying to be fair. "He doesn't know the specifics. It could be anything from an aggressive press campaign to something physical," Sirius said. "I know Arcturus Nott. He doesn't use violence. But he's an old man who is watching the structure he's built for 40 years begin to come apart faster than he planned for, and people in that situation sometimes decide that the rules they've always followed are no longer sufficient." "He wouldn't go directly at Harry," Ron said. His voice was steady and thinking out loud. "Too obvious, too traceable, too much scrutiny given the current profile. But there are other ways to interfere." He looked at Harry. "The claims. If something happened to the physical documentation before the sitting, Gringotts," Harry said. "It's all registered at Gringotts. He can't touch it there." "The witnesses," Hermione said quietly. That landed in the room differently. Griselda Marchbanks, whose testimony was the cornerstone of the Merlin and Emery's claims, the two Nott had explicitly identified as his most viable challenge targets. An 84-year-old woman living alone in Hogsmeade, with no security, no active protective spells beyond standard household wards, and a profile significant enough that threatening her would be dangerous and specific enough that it might not immediately be traceable to Nott directly. "She needs a warning," Harry said. He was already standing. "And protection, if she'll accept it." "She won't accept it," Hermione said. "Not official protection. She's too independent for that." "Then I go personally." He looked at Sirius. "Can you manage things here for a few hours?" "I've been managing things here for 2 years," Sirius said. "Go." Harry went, taking Ron with him because Ron had the specific quality of being the most naturally reassuring presence in any room he entered, not because he was soft, but because his fundamental solidity communicated, without words, that things were going to be all right. Griselda Marchbanks lived in a tall, narrow house at the edge of Hogsmeade that looked like it had been built specifically for a person who had too many books and strong opinions about architecture. Every windowsill had plants. The door was dark green and had, when Harry knocked, the particular sound of a door that was paying attention. She opened it herself, took one look at Harry and Ron, and said, "I wondered when you'd come." "You'd better come in." She was already aware. That was clear from the way she moved through her sitting room, unhurried but with a particular alertness, and the way she'd had tea ready, which meant she'd been expecting visitors and had been ready to receive them quickly. She poured without asking whether they wanted any and sat across from them with the expression of someone who was about to say something direct. "There was a visitor," she said. "Yesterday evening. One of Nott's people. I didn't recognize him, but I know the family signatures and this one carried a Nott family connection. He was very polite. He asked whether I intended to appear before the Wisengamot, and when I said I did, he asked whether I had considered the strain of public testimony at my age." She looked at Harry with those black eyes sharp as ever. "I told him that at my age, I have earned the right to do as I please, and that anyone who found that inconvenient was welcome to express their feelings to my front door, which is a great deal less patient than I am." "Did he threaten you?" Harry said. "Not directly," she said. "He didn't need to. The implication was sufficient." She sipped her tea. "I am not intimidated by implications. I have been in situations considerably more dangerous than a veiled suggestion from a junior political operative. But I thought you should know. We're going to increase security around you," Harry said. "You are not going to increase security around me," she said, pleasantly but with absolute firmness. "With respect, I am 84 years old and I sat on the Wisengamot for 60 years and I have warded this house against things that would make a junior Nott operative go home and rethink his life choices. I do not need protection." She set down her cup. What I need is to know that when I walk into that chamber in 5 days, the documentation I bring with me will be sufficient to end any procedural challenge before it can be properly mounted. Griselda Marchbanks's testimony, Hermione had told him, is the cornerstone. Harry thought about that and then thought about what additional weight they could put behind it. What if the testimony was corroborated, he said. Not just your witness account, but a second independent party. Someone whose relationship with the Wizengamot is unimpeachable. She considered. It would help. The corroboration standard for ancient claiming trials is 2 witnesses of recognized standing. I am one. A second would make challenge effectively impossible. She looked at him over her teacup. Who do you have in mind? Someone who understands ancient magical law better than almost anyone alive, Harry said. And who I should have gone to sooner. He looked at Ron. Ron blinked. Then he understood. Dumbledore's portrait. Hogwarts was quiet in the summer in a way Harry had always found slightly eerie, full of its own substance and presence without the noise of 1,000 students filling it with life. The castle felt, in July, like a held breath. McGonagall met them at the entrance hall. She had been headmistress for 2 years now, and the role suited her in the way that things suit people who were always meant to have them but got there by a harder road than they deserved. She looked at Harry with the complicated warmth she always had for him, the teacher's pride and the mother-adjacent ache and the particular exasperation of someone who genuinely loved a person who consistently walked directly into the most difficult possible situation. Harry, she said. Professor. I heard about the inheritance, she said. I read the Prophet, which I treat as a starting point for identifying what is wrong rather than what is true. She looked at him steadily. Are you all right? I'm good, he said. And meant it. I need to speak to Dumbledore's portrait. Something moved in her expression. Not resistance, something more careful than that. He's aware of what's been happening, she said. Portraits share information through the frame network. I think he'll want to see you. He did. The headmistress's office was full of afternoon light and the warm hum of a room that had held significant magic for a very long time. The portraits around the walls were mostly pretending to be asleep with varying degrees of conviction. Dumbledore's was the largest, hung behind the desk where it had been for decades, and the painted version of the man Harry had known looked at him from the canvas with an expression that was difficult to read, which was also very familiar. Harry stood in front of the portrait for a moment. You look well, Dumbledore said. His painted voice was slightly different from the real one, the same warmth but with a flatness behind it, the quality of an echo rather than a source. You look, if I may say, like yourself. More than you have in a long time. I'm coming to ask you something, Harry said. I'm not coming to have a conversation about the past. Of course not, Dumbledore said, without any indication of offense. The Wizengamot sitting is in 5 days. Griselda Marchbanks will testify to the Merlin and Emery's claiming trials. But the procedural challenge will be stronger if there's no corroborating witness of equivalent standing. Harry held the portrait's painted gaze. I need your formal attestation. A portrait statement, witnessed and signed, confirming the validity of the blood accounting as you understand it and the legitimacy of the lineage connections. He paused. Portrait testimony is admissible as evidence under Clause 14 of the Magical Evidence Act. You know the inheritance law better than anyone. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. His painted eyes had an expression that Harry recognized from the real version, the look of someone who was deeply aware of something they owed another person. I could have told you, Dumbledore said. About the genealogy. About the Emery's connection. I knew, Harry. I had seen Lily's genealogy commission, she told me about it when she was making her will. I kept it from you because I was, he paused. Managing things. As I always did. I know, Harry said. That's not what I'm here about. I know it isn't, Dumbledore said. But I am saying it because you deserve to hear me say it. A pause. I will give you the attestation. Every piece of it, as formally and completely as portrait testimony allows. He paused again, differently. I am proud of you. I know that may not mean as much from a painting as it would have. It means something, Harry said, because that was true. He reached up and touched the corner of the frame briefly, the way he might have touched an old friend's shoulder. It means something. He left the castle with the portrait attestation sealed and witnessed by McGonagall, which added a second layer of institutional credibility that could not challenge without challenging the integrity of Hogwarts itself. He was beginning to feel, not for the first time that week, like he was 3 steps ahead. He didn't trust the feeling entirely. Being 3 steps ahead in a chess game didn't help you if someone flipped the board. The meeting with Lord Selwyn happened at 4 that afternoon, in a private room at the Leaky Cauldron. Selwyn was 56, compact and careful, with the manner of someone who weighed every word before speaking and had been doing it for so long it was simply how he thought. He came with no companions, which Harry noted as a gesture. He looked at Harry across the table and said, I want to understand what you intend to do with these seats. Represent them, Harry said. That's not an answer. Then I'll be more specific. Harry leaned forward slightly. I intend to vote consistently in favor of full legal recognition for Muggle-born magical families, the revision of property laws that currently disadvantage non-pure-blood households, and the establishment of an independent oversight mechanism for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I intend to publicly oppose any motion that restricts access to magical education on the basis of blood status. And I intend to push for a full review of the Wisengamot's procedural rules, specifically the ones that have historically allowed well-connected individuals to tie legitimate inheritance claims in procedural mud. He paused. That last one will affect some people's interests. Including, possibly, yours, depending on what those interests are. Selwyn looked at him for a long moment. You're not going to soften that. No. Most people coming into this much political capital would offer more ambiguity. It gives people more room to support you comfortably. I know, Harry said. I'm not interested in comfortable support. Comfortable support disappears when things get difficult. I'd rather know exactly who's with me before the sitting than find out after. Selwyn was quiet, and then something in his expression settled, the look of a man who had made a decision and was acknowledging it. I'll vote for recognition, he said. Not because I agree with all of your positions. Because the principle of the ancient law is sound and because anyone willing to be that direct in a private meeting is going to be more manageable than someone who's hiding what they want. More manageable, Harry repeated. People you can predict, Selwyn said, are always more manageable than people you can't. Even when you disagree with them. He stood. I'll see you in the chamber, Lord Potter. Harry noted, this time, that Selwyn used the title. Tuesday arrived with a problem. Not a procedural one. Not paperwork. Ron came into Harry's room at 7 in the morning with a look on his face that Harry had learned to read across many years of friendship as the expression that meant something had happened to a person rather than a plan. It's Daphne, Ron said. Harry was already on his feet. What happened? Nothing, she's fine. She's downstairs. Ron's jaw moved in the way it did when he was choosing words carefully. Her father came last night. To Grimmauld Place. I don't know how he found the address. Not, Harry said flatly. Almost certainly. He came to bring her home. She didn't go. A pause. There was it wasn't quiet. She's fine, I said she's fine, but she's been sitting in the library since 2 in the morning and Hermione said she didn't sleep. Harry went downstairs. The library was grey with early morning light and Daphne was in the chair by the window, the same window seat Luna had occupied that first morning, which felt like a long time ago now. She had a book open on her lap that she clearly wasn't reading. She looked up when Harry came in and her expression did something careful and controlled that was trying to look like it was fine and wasn't entirely succeeding. You don't need to do this, she said. Do what? He sat down on the window seat opposite her. The concerned check-in. Her voice was precise and her posture was impeccable, and the book on her lap was upside down. I'm not someone who needs managing through difficult emotions. I made a decision and it had consequences and I don't regret it. I'm not here to manage you, Harry said. I'm here because Ron said you've been up since 2 and I wanted to know if you needed anything. She looked at him. The controlled expression was still there, but something under it shifted slightly. He said I was embarrassing the family, she said. Which is not new. He also said that if I aligned with your ascension and it failed, House Greengrass would bear the political cost of having backed a losing claim, and I was being reckless with our family standing. Is that what you think? That it might fail? She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I don't think it'll fail. You're too well organized and you've moved too quickly and you have too many strong witnesses and you've already neutralized his best procedural weapons. She paused. I think my father is frightened, and frightened people make arguments that sound logical but are really just fear. What does he want? Harry said. Really? For things to stay the way they are, she said immediately, and then seemed slightly surprised at the speed of her own answer. He's not a bad person. He's someone who built a good life inside an unjust system and is terrified that changing the system means losing the life. She looked down at the upside-down book. I understand the fear. I just can't agree with what he does with it. Harry thought about Arcturus not sitting in his beautiful house in Wiltshire saying the same kind of thing in more sophisticated language. He thought about all the various ways that fear translated into opposition, from the petty to the grand. When this is over, he said, and the sitting is done and the seats are formally recognized, I'm going to need people who understand both sides of the old world. Who know how it worked and why it needs to change and can navigate the space between. He looked at her. You're exactly that. She looked back at him, assessing whether this was a consolation or a genuine thing. It's not a consolation prize, he said, because her expression had asked the question. I know, she said, after a moment. I just wanted to be sure you did. The corner of his mouth moved. You know, you and Ron have a similar quality. She blinked. Do we? You both spend years being underestimated by people who should know better, and you both have a habit of saying I know when someone finally tells you you're capable, because you've always known and you're tired of having to wait for someone else to notice. She was quiet for several seconds. The early morning light was gray and soft through the library window, and outside Grimmauld Place was beginning its ordinary day. Then she closed the upside-down book and set it on the sill and said, Did anyone ever tell you that you're surprisingly perceptive for someone who spent most of school too busy surviving to notice much? Hermione tells me once a year, he said. Usually in a way that's simultaneously a compliment and a criticism. She almost smiled. It was brief and slightly surprised, like something she hadn't been planning to do. I'm all right, she said. Genuinely. Thank you for coming. He left her with the morning light coming stronger through the window and took the stairs 2 at a time back to the kitchen, where the day was already moving and there was work left to do. Wednesday and Thursday passed in a blur of meetings, filings, and the particular kind of preparation that wasn't flashy but mattered, the consolidation of every piece of documentation into a complete, unassailable record, the confirmation of every witness, the careful political work that Daphne and Neville did together with the comfortable efficiency of 2 people who had different skills that happened to complement each other perfectly. By Thursday evening they had, by Neville's count, confirmed 17 votes in favor of recognition. Not had 19. 7 votes were genuinely undecided. It's going to be close, Neville said, at the Thursday evening briefing in the kitchen. He didn't say it with anxiety, just precision. We need 4 of the 7 undecideds, Daphne said. I know 2 of them personally. They're persuadable. The other 5 are political operatives. They'll vote with whoever they think is going to win. Then we make sure it's clear we're going to win, Harry said. Which requires, walking in there and acting like we've already won, he said. Not arrogance. Certainty. There's a difference. He looked around the table. If we walk into that chamber tomorrow looking like people who are hoping it goes our way, the undecideds will smell the uncertainty. We walk in like people who have already done the work and are simply waiting for the procedure to catch up with the reality. Which we have, Ron said. Which we have, Harry agreed. 8 claims, all registered, all documented, all witnessed. Ancient law behind us, Griselda Marchbanks and Albus Dumbledore's portrait attestation as our evidence, Neville's guardian oath formally recorded, and a Lord's formal presence declaration already on the sitting agenda that the Wizengamot is legally obligated to address. He paused. Not has 19 votes and procedural arguments that lost their 3 best targets when he withdrew them on Monday. It wasn't bravado. It was just true, laid out plainly, and the truth of it settled into the room the way it always did when you said it clearly enough. That night, the last night before the sitting, Harry sat on the roof of Grimmauld Place. He discovered this spot in the first month of living here, a flat section of the old roof accessible through a window at the top of the stairs, invisible from the street, with a view over the London rooftops and the particular quality of nighttime London spreading in every direction. He came here when he needed to think without anyone offering to help. He had Lily's portrait with him. He set it on the parapet and looked at it. The painted Lily was working at her desk, as she always was when he wasn't looking directly at her, and she looked up when he set the portrait down. She had the expression she wore when she knew he had something to say and was waiting for him to find the words. "Tomorrow," he said. She nodded. "I'm not afraid," he said. "That's not what this is. He stopped. Looked at the London sky, at the scattered low stars visible through the orange glow. "I wanted you to know that what you set up, the genealogy, the trust, the protection you built around it, it worked. It all worked exactly the way you meant it to." Lily put down her painted quill. She looked at him with the full weight of that expression that still, even after weeks of carrying the portrait, hit him somewhere deep and fundamental. She picked up the quill and wrote on the edge of her parchment, the way she did when she wanted to say something that needed to be said carefully. "You did the work. I gave you the tools. Never confuse those two things." He looked at that for a long time. "I won't," he said. He sat on the roof of Grimmauld Place until midnight, watching London, with his mother's portrait beside him and 8 houses settled warm and real in his blood, and the morning, and everything the morning meant, coming steadily closer through the dark. He wasn't afraid. He was, he thought, finally and completely, exactly where he was supposed to be. Chapter 6, Lord of 8. The Wizengamot chamber smelled of old stone and older magic. Harry had been inside it before, twice, and both times under circumstances designed to make him feel small. The first time he'd been 15, sitting in a chair with chains on the arms in a room full of purple robes, watching Dumbledore dismantle the case against him with the careful precision of someone demonstrating a lesson. The second time he'd been 17, giving testimony in the war trials, standing at a podium while 36 pairs of eyes weighed whether what he said was useful to them. Both times the room had been used as a tool against him. Both times the architecture of the place, the high tiers of seats, the single chair on the floor, the deliberate arrangement of power looking down at the individual, had been meant to communicate something specific about where he stood in relation to everything above him. He walked in this time through the main entrance, which was not the door they'd used before. The main entrance was reserved for seated lords, and the usher who opened it for him was a small, precise woman who had been doing this job for 30 years and whose expression, when she saw the 8 house rings, did something she probably would have suppressed if she'd had more warning. Sirius walked beside him. Neville was 2 steps back on his left. Hermione and Ron were in the observer gallery above, which was not where Harry wanted them but was where the rules put people who weren't seated lords, and Hermione had made peace with this only after extracting a promise that Harry would remember every detail for a full debrief afterward. Daphne was in the gallery too. She'd come with her chin up and her expression arranged in the particular composure of someone who had made a choice they intended to stand behind, and when Harry had seen her in the atrium she'd caught his eye and nodded once, and that had been the whole of it. The chamber was full. Harry had known it would be. The Lord's formal presence declaration on the agenda had guaranteed that, but the specific quality of full was different from what he'd expected. It wasn't a hostile crowd. It was a watchful one. 63 witches and wizards in the tiered seats, most of them in Wizengamot robes of plum purple, and every single one of them looking at the main entrance when he walked in. Not with unified hostility or unified approval. With the expression of people who understood that something significant was about to happen and were not yet sure what side of it they wanted to be on. Harry walked to the floor of the chamber and felt 63 pairs of eyes follow him, and he looked back at the room without performing anything. No swagger, no deliberate display, just the natural ease of someone who had already done the hard part and was here for the formal acknowledgement. Arcturus Knott was in his seat near the top of the right tier. He was looking at Harry with the expression of a chess player who has made all his moves and is waiting to see if they were enough. He looked, Harry thought, like a man who had spent 4 days reassessing his position and had arrived at a kind of wary respect. Not surrender. Not yet. But something. The chief warlock was Tiberius Ogden, a broad-shouldered wizard in his late 60s with a blunt, undecorated manner that Harry had always found preferable to the theatrically diplomatic style some of his predecessors had favored. Ogden called the session to order with 2 strikes of his staff on the chamber floor, and the assembled lords settled. First item, Ogden said, and his voice was the particular voice of someone who did not feel the need to project it, because the chamber's acoustics were designed to carry every word regardless of volume. Lord's Formal Presence Declaration. Filed by Harry James Potter, citing claims to 8 noble and most ancient houses under the Ancient Potter Inheritance Accords of 1203. He looked at Harry without expression. Lord Potter, you may present. Harry stepped forward to the speaking position. The chamber was very quiet. He'd thought about whether to prepare a speech. He'd decided against it for the same reason he'd decided against performing certainty the night before, because prepared speeches in rooms like this sounded like prepared speeches, and what he needed the room to hear was not rhetoric but reality. He stood at the speaking position with 8 rings warm on his hands and looked at the assembled Wizengamot and said, clearly and without preamble, my mother was 21 years old when she commissioned a genealogical accounting of the Evans bloodline. She hid it in a Gringotts vault, lodged a blood seal activation document with the Department of Magical Records, and told her sister what she'd done. She died a year later. Her sister held that document for 16 years, almost destroyed it 3 times, and chose not to. When Petunia Dursley died 12 days ago, the blood seal activated and the Ancient Potter Inheritance Accords were triggered. He paused, not for effect but because the next part needed its own space. What my mother's genealogy shows, verified by the Goblin Genealogists Guild and confirmed by Gringotts' blood accounting stone, is that I am the direct blood heir of 8 noble and most ancient houses, Potter, Peveril, Black, Gryffindor, Slytherin, Merlin, Emrys, and Pendragon. The claiming trials for each house have been completed. Every trial has been documented. 6 have physical documentation registered with Gringotts. The Merlin and Emrys trials were witnessed independently by Griselda Marchbanks, whose testimony is formally submitted to this chamber. He reached into his jacket and produced the sealed document case, the one that contained Marchbanks's testimony, Dumbledore's portrait attestation, Neville's guardian oath registration, and the complete Gringotts claiming record. He placed it on the evidence table. I am asking this chamber to formally recognize the 8 claims and seat me accordingly. He stepped back. For a moment, nothing. The kind of nothing that is actually very full of things. Then Arcturus Knott rose from his seat. He rose slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone who wanted the chamber's attention before he spoke, and he had it. 62 pairs of eyes moved to him as naturally as water finding a level. He had been directing Wizengamot attention for 40 years and the mechanism of it was, Harry acknowledged, impressive. Chief Warlock, Knott said. His voice was the measured, precise instrument of someone who had used it in rooms like this many times. I rise to note the formal objections filed by this member in advance of today's sitting. Specifically, 2 constitutional objections to the principle of multi-seat concentration, which I believe this chamber has an obligation to address before proceeding to recognition. Ogden looked at Harry. A procedural nod. Harry stepped forward again. I'd ask Lord not to specify the constitutional provision he believes these objections invoke, he said. Since the 1203 Accords contain no provision limiting the number of houses a qualifying heir may hold simultaneously, and no subsequent legislation has modified that position, I'd like to understand the constitutional basis for an objection to a proceeding that is itself constitutionally mandated. A murmur moved through the chamber. Not loud, these were not people who made obvious noise, but present. Nott's expression remained composed. The constitutional concern is broader than the text of the Accords, he said. It pertains to the principle of Wiesengemot balance, which has been the foundational governance model of this institution since 1692, Harry said. When the Wiesengemot was restructured under the International Statute of Secrecy. The balance principle was established then, between the existing seated houses, as a mechanism to prevent post-statute concentration of power among the old families who retained influence while Muggle-born and half-blood families were systematically excluded from seats. He let that land for a moment. The balance Lord Nott is defending was not designed to protect everyone. It was designed to protect a specific group's dominance. I'd ask the chamber to consider whether that's the principle we want to invoke today. The murmur this time was different. Louder. More directional. Nott's composure held, but only just. That is a characterization of history rather than a legal argument, he said. Then let's talk legal argument, Harry said. He looked at the chief warlock. The Accords of 1203 predate the 1692 restructuring by nearly 5 centuries. Under the principle of legal precedence, older law supersedes newer statute where they conflict. If Lord Nott's constitutional objection relies on the 1692 balance principle, it is subordinate to the 1203 Accords, which not only permit but specifically provide for multi-seat inheritance where bloodline qualification is met. There is no legal conflict. There is only a political preference being dressed in constitutional language. Ogden was looking at Harry with an expression that was, underneath its professional neutrality, intensely interested. Nott remained standing. For the first time in the proceeding, something shifted behind his composure, not defeat, but the specific quality of a man who is recognizing that the argument he prepared for and the argument he's actually having are different animals. He had expected to fight procedural battles. He was fighting a legal one instead, and Harry had spent 5 days with Hermione rebuilding the legal framework from the ground up. The objections, Nott said finally, are entered into the record. And noted, Harry said. As is the fact that Lord Nott, 4 days ago, withdrew 3 of his 7 filed challenges following a private meeting in which we discussed the matter directly. He looked at Nott, not with hostility, simply with the particular frankness of someone who had decided the room should have the full picture. I respect Lord Nott. I think he has genuine concerns about how concentrated power functions in a governing body, and I think those concerns deserve a serious hearing. I disagree with his method of addressing them. I believe the right response to a fear about concentrated power is transparent governance, not procedural interference with legitimate law. He paused. When I sit in this chamber with 8 seats, every vote I cast will be on the public record. Every position I take will be stated and accountable. The concentration of power is only dangerous when it operates without transparency. I'm telling this chamber, clearly and publicly, what I intend to do with these seats. That's more than most lords in this room can say. Silence. A different quality of silence from the one at the beginning, denser, more deliberate, the silence of people thinking rather than waiting. Nott sat down. It was not a surrender. But it was an acknowledgement that the floor was no longer his. What followed was 2 hours of formal procedure, which was its own kind of battle, documentation reviewed, testimony entered, objections noted and addressed, the grinding machinery of institutional recognition moving with the particular pace of systems that had been designed to be thorough rather than fast. Griselda Marchbanks appeared in person for her testimony, which she gave with the clipped authority of someone who had testified before this chamber 40 times and found it less impressive each time but was prepared to do it properly. She described the Glastonbury vault in precise, academic detail. She described Harry's completion of both claiming trials. She described the activation of the house magic in the language of someone who had witnessed extraordinary things and was not inclined to understate them but was equally not inclined to dramatize. Both trials were complete and unambiguous, she said, in conclusion. The house magic of Merlin and Emery's recognized Lord Potter without qualification. I have been a student of ancient magical law for 60 years and I have never witnessed a cleaner claiming activation. Any challenge to the validity of these claims is not a legal challenge. It is an expression of preference. She left the testimony podium without waiting to be dismissed, because she was 84 years old and had no patience for procedural courtesy beyond what was strictly required. Then Dumbledore's portrait attestation was read into the record by the chamber clerk, which created a different quality of silence, the particular quiet of people confronted with the voice of someone they had all known and most of them had complicated feelings about, speaking from beyond death with the simple, undecorated statement that the claims were legitimate, the law was clear, and the chamber should proceed accordingly. Harry watched the faces in the tiers. He could see Selwyn, who was listening with the focused attention of someone who had already decided but was checking his reasoning. He could see several of the undecideds, people Daphne had named, people whose faces he'd memorized from the list, people who were watching not sit quietly while the evidence accumulated and were drawing their own conclusions. Neville was called for the guardian oath testimony. He stood at the podium with the quiet, absolute steadiness that was simply how he occupied space now, and described the Longbottom family records, the 1204 oath, and its activation at Camlin in the same tone he might have used to discuss the weather, certain, unhurried, as though the significance of what he was saying was self-evident and didn't require amplification. The oath is active, he said. House Longbottom is formally bound as guardian witness to Lord Pendragon. The claiming at Camlin was completed. I was present. He paused. I would also like it entered into the record that I consider it an honor. He stepped back. Somewhere above, Harry heard a sound that was probably Ron, which was immediately muffled in a way that suggested Hermione. Ogden called for the vote. Harry stood on the chamber floor and watched it happen. Not with held breath, not with anxiety, with the clear-eyed attention of someone who had done the work and was now simply watching the result arrive. Not had 19 votes. He needed 20 to block recognition. 17 were confirmed in favor. 7 undecided. The vote was electronic in the modern sense of the Wisengamot. Each lord placed their voting token in the assigned column, and the count appeared on the chamber's central display in numbers that everyone could see. Harry watched the confirmed supporters go first, 17 tokens dropping in clean succession. Then Not's 19, arranged across the against column with the precision of someone who had organized them. Then the undecideds, one by one. Selwyn voted for recognition. That was 18. 2 votes went to Not. 21 against. Harry watched this without expression. 3 more votes for recognition. 21. 2 votes for Not. 23 against. 1 vote left. Lord Hyacinth Parkinson, a name Harry hadn't heard until Daphne mentioned it on Thursday, a small, careful woman who had been watching the proceedings with the expression of someone performing a very rapid internal calculation, dropped her token in the for recognition column. 22 to 23. Harry blinked. The count didn't change. 22 for, 23 against. He felt the arithmetic with absolute clarity. 22 to 23 was a loss. Then something happened that Harry had not planned for, because it came from a direction he hadn't been watching. Arcturus Not rose from his seat. The chamber shifted. Everyone looked at him, the way they always did, the 40-year gravity of the man pulling attention naturally. Harry looked at him too, without urgency, and found that Nott was not looking at the vote display. He was looking at Harry. His expression was, not what Harry expected. The composure was still there. Underneath it was something complicated, the same something Harry had seen briefly in Wiltshire when he'd smiled that small, private chess player's smile. Nott reached into his robes and produced his voting token. He placed it in the for recognition column. 23 to 23. A tie. The chamber erupted, not in shouting, these were Wizengamot members, but in the kind of collective controlled noise that in any other gathering would have been shouting. Ogden struck his staff 3 times. Under Wizengamot procedure, a tie vote on a lord's formal presence declaration was broken by the chief warlock. Ogden looked at the count. He looked at Harry. He looked at the evidence table with its sealed documentation, at the spot where Griselda Marchbanks had stood and demolished every procedural challenge in 30 minutes of clipped, airtight testimony. He looked at the chamber record that showed 8 claiming trials completed, documented, and witnessed. He picked up his staff and struck the floor once. The tiebreaker vote is cast in favor of recognition, he said. Harry James Potter is formally recognized as Lord of Houses Potter, Peveril, Black, Gryffindor, Slytherin, Merlin, Emrys, and Pendragon, in accordance with the ancient Potter inheritance accords of 1203. Let the record reflect the seating date as the 19th of July. The chamber was very quiet. Then, from the observer gallery above, one person began to applaud. Harry didn't need to look up to know it was Ron. The sound of it was absolutely Ron, full-handed and entirely unself-conscious, the applause of someone who had no patience for formal dignity when something worth celebrating had just happened. Hermione joined him. And then, after a moment, from the gallery, others. Harry stood on the floor of the Wizengamot chamber and looked at the record display showing his name against 8 houses and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. He turned to look at Nott. Nott was still standing. He met Harry's gaze with the expression of a man who has made a decision he's going to have to live with and has decided, in the final moment, that he can live with it. Harry nodded at him. One specific, direct nod. Not gratitude, the situation was too complicated for simple gratitude. More like acknowledgement. The recognition one person gives another when they've been honest in a way they didn't have to be. Nott held his gaze for a moment, and then inclined his head by exactly the same degree. Outside the ministry, in the atrium, the group reconvened with the slightly dazed quality of people who had been in a pressurized environment and had just emerged into ordinary air. Ron was still visibly electric, moving with the excess energy of someone who had been sitting still for 2 hours while momentous things happened and was now releasing it in the form of rapid movement and an inability to stop talking. The tie, he kept saying. Did you see the tie? I was watching the count and I thought, we all thought, Hermione said, though her voice was warm and slightly unsteady at the edges. I didn't, Sirius said. You're lying, Ron said. I am, Sirius agreed, cheerfully, and pulled Harry into a one-armed embrace that lasted long enough to say everything that couldn't be said with words in a ministry atrium. Neville was standing to one side with the settled expression of someone who had watched the guardian oath formalized in front of 63 witnesses and felt, not the burden of it, but the rightness. He caught Harry's eye and smiled, the Neville smile, which was quiet and real and carried more warmth in it than most people's biggest gestures. Luna had been in the gallery and emerged now with her grey robes and her pencil still behind her ears, and she said, it was a very good atmospheric day. I told you the clouds would be right. Then she hugged Harry briefly and firmly and said, into his shoulder, your mother would be so pleased, which was the thing that hit hardest, the way Luna's truest things always did, by being entirely direct. Harry held on to that for a moment. Daphne was last. She had come down from the gallery in her own time, without rushing, and when Harry turned she was standing at a slight distance with the expression she always wore when she wasn't sure how something would be received, the careful composure that was almost the same as hiding but wasn't quite. Your father voted against, Harry said. I know, she said. That's going to be difficult. Probably. She looked at him. I'll manage it. I've been managing difficult things in my family for 3 years. I know how it works. You don't have to manage it alone, he said. She was quiet for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, not the brief almost smile from the library, something more considered. You have 8 houses and a formal Wisengamot seat and a political restructuring to begin, she said. I think you have enough to manage. The two things aren't mutually exclusive, he said. You told me you were tired of being quiet. I told you I needed people who understood both sides of the old world. He paused. Neither of those things stopped being true because we won the vote. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, with the particular Daphne Greengrass quality of conceding a point while still sounding like she's in control of the concession, fine. I'll help with the political restructuring. Good, he said. It's going to be considerable work. I know. And I expect to be properly consulted, not just briefed after decisions are made. Wouldn't have it any other way. The almost smile arrived, and this time it stayed slightly longer. Good, she said, which was the first time she'd used his word back at him, and he was fairly sure it was deliberate. They went back to Grimmauld Place. This was not a decision anyone made explicitly, it was simply where they all went, as naturally as water running downhill, because that was what the house had become over the last 12 days. Not just Harry's house or Sirius's house but the particular, specific, irreproducible place that belongs to a group of people who have done something important together. The kitchen was warm and Sirius made food, which he was actually quite good at when he chose to apply himself, and they sat around the table in the evening light and ate and talked and were simply present with each other in the way that felt, to Harry, like one of the rarer things the world had to offer. He sat at the head of the table, which he'd never done before and which nobody commented on, and he looked around at the people in the room, Sirius at the stove, easy and warm, carrying none of the Azkaban tension in his shoulders tonight. Hermione with her notebook open but untouched, actually present in the meal rather than in the work for once. Ron eating with the unself-conscious enthusiasm that was one of his best qualities, talking to Neville about something Harry couldn't quite hear. Neville laughing at it, which meant Ron had said something genuinely funny rather than just the attempt at funny that was his other gear. Luna looking at the light through her glass and deciding something about it that was entirely her own. Daphne at the far end of the table, a little separate still but present, watching the group with the expression of someone encountering something they hadn't known they wanted. Harry thought about the last 12 days. About the owl with the black ribbon landing on the kitchen windowsill. About the document Petunia had protected for 16 years and the portrait of his mother writing "I trusted you'd be enough." About the Somerset marshes and the Glastonbury vault and the Cumbrian valley and the standing stone with 2 words appearing on its surface that had felt, at the time, less like an award and more like an acknowledgement. About Arcturus not placing his token in the for recognition column in a chamber full of witnesses, making a choice that cost him something, because he was intelligent enough to recognize when the structure of a thing had changed irreversibly and stubborn enough to still find it difficult. About the 63 lords in the Wisengamot chamber who now knew that the new structure included Harry Potter with 8 seats, 8 votes, and an entirely clear statement of what he intended to do with them. "You're thinking loudly," Hermione said, from across the table. "I was thinking about what comes next," he said. "Already?" "It doesn't stop," he said. "The Wisengamot recognized the claims. That's one thing. The Ministry's structural problems aren't solved by a vote in the chamber. The Muggle-born families who lost land claims to procedural mud haven't had those claims addressed. The law enforcement review hasn't started. The educational access question hasn't been raised formally." He paused. Today was necessary. It wasn't sufficient. No, Hermione agreed, with the warmth she had for him when he was being most himself. It wasn't. "We should take tonight," Ron said, from across the table, without looking up from his plate. "Just tonight. The world'll still need fixing in the morning." Harry looked at him. Ron glanced up with the steady, certain look that Harry had known for 7 years, the look that said, "I know what you're going to say and you should listen to what I'm saying instead." "One night, mate. We did good." Harry considered this. Then he picked up his fork. "One night," he agreed. Ron nodded, satisfied, and returned to his food. Later, after dinner, after Sirius had produced a bottle of something very old from the Black family cellar and the table had shifted from dinner to the particular warmth of people who have nothing left to do today but be with each other, Harry slipped out to the back garden. Grimmauld Place's back garden was not impressive, a narrow strip of London ground, high-walled, mostly flagstone, with the neglected quality of something that had been left alone for years. But there was a sky above it, and the London stars, and the particular quality of summer night air. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and took out Lily's portrait. The miniature Lily looked up from her painted desk. She had the expression she wore when she'd been waiting and was glad the wait was over, patient, warm, and quietly full of something that ran too deep for the small canvas to entirely hold. He held the portrait up so she could see the sky. It seemed like the right thing to do. She looked at the sky for a moment. Then she looked at him. She picked up her quill. She turned to the familiar edge of her parchment and wrote something, slowly, in the careful hand that he'd come to know over 12 days, the way you came to know something precious, not by studying it but by being glad it was there. 8. I knew it would be 8. He read it and felt something move through him that was not grief exactly and was not joy exactly and was made of both in the specific proportion that only came from loving someone you'd never gotten to know properly, who had loved you before you had the language for it, who had built you a foundation in the year before her death with the ferocity of someone who knew the time was short. "You knew," he said softly. She nodded, simply, the way she always did when what she was saying was too obvious to require more. He stood in the back garden of Grimmauld Place with his mother's portrait in his hand and 8 houses settled warm and permanent in his blood and the sound of his friends' voices coming warm and clear through the kitchen window and the London sky overhead, and he let himself simply be in it. No next move. No urgency. No shape of a threat to plan against. Just this, the specific, irreplaceable thing of having done something real and being with the people you love in the aftermath of it. One night. Ron was right. The world would still need fixing in the morning. The ministry's structures were still crooked. The families who had been failed by 20 years of deliberate neglect still needed someone to fight for them. Arcturus Knott was still alive and still intelligent and would still, in time, test the new structure in the ways that intelligent opposition always did. There was more to do than any one person or one night could hold. But tonight the 8 houses were recognized. Tonight Lily's work had been answered. Tonight Petunia Dursley's decision, made 3 separate times in front of 3 separate fires, not to destroy a document she was afraid of, had done exactly what a small, frightened, brave woman had asked it to do. Tonight was enough. Harry put his mother's portrait carefully back inside his jacket, against his heart where he'd been carrying her since Gringotts, and went inside. The kitchen light was warm through the window. Sirius was laughing at something, the full, unguarded laugh that had taken 2 years to become his natural sound again. Luna was explaining the atmospheric significance of the evening clouds to Daphne, who was listening with the expression of someone who had decided to simply accept that Luna said true things in unusual ways. Neville and Ron were arguing cheerfully about something that sounded like Quidditch. Hermione was finally writing in her notebook, but she was smiling while she did it, which was the tell. Harry opened the door and stepped inside. Finally, Ron said, without looking up. "We saved you the good chair." The good chair was Harry's chair, at the head of the table, which was where he sat now. Which was where he would sit tomorrow and the day after and for every day of the work that was still to come. He sat down. He was 17 years old and lord of 8 noble and most ancient houses and the son of Lily Potter who had known it would be 8 and the godson of Sirius Black who had waited 12 years for exactly this and the friend of people who had chosen him, specifically and repeatedly, with full knowledge of what that choice involved. He picked up his drink. Right, he said. What are we talking about? The kitchen filled up with answer.